Walk into any museum with an Egyptian collection and you'll feel it immediately. That peculiar hush that settles over rooms filled with gold and stone. People whisper here, even when there's no rule demanding silence. They move slowly past display cases containing objects that gleam under carefully positioned lights. A golden mask catches the eye first. Always. Then perhaps a massive statue of a pharaoh, arms crossed, expression eternal. The placards speak of divine kingship, of gods walking among mortals, of civilization reaching toward the heavens through monuments that still stand after thousands of years. It's beautiful. It's carefully arranged, and it's a lie. Not a lie in the sense that these objects are fake. They're real enough. The gold was mined from Nubian earth. The stone was quarried from Egyptian bedrock. The craftsmanship is undeniable. But the story these objects tell, the narrative constructed by their selection and arrangement, that's where the deception lives. Because for every golden mask sitting behind glass in London or Paris or New York, there are 10,000 pottery shards sitting in storage boxes that no one will ever see. For every statue of a pharaoh positioned to inspire awe, there are countless bones of ordinary people catalogued and forgotten in basement archives. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. The men who excavated Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries came with specific goals. They wanted treasures that would fill European museums and justify the expense of their expeditions. They wanted discoveries spectacular enough to capture public imagination and secure future funding. They wanted evidence of a civilization so grand, so mysterious, so fundamentally different from anything else that its study required Western expertise to unlock its secrets. And they found exactly what they were looking for, partly because that's what they chose to look for. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the world watched breathlessly as golden artifacts emerged from the earth. What the world didn't watch was the workers' village at Deir el Medina, just a few kilometers away, where the people who actually built the royal tombs had lived. Those homes, filled with their own stories written on broken pottery and limestone fragments, were considered less worthy of attention. The pottery was catalogued briefly, then boxed. The fragments were sorted and stored, and the narrative remained fixed on kings and gold. At Giza, early excavators moved tons of earth, searching for entrances to pyramids and hidden chambers filled with treasure. In the process, they literally swept aside the bones of the workers who built those pyramids. Human remains that could have told us about diet, health, working conditions, and daily life were treated as debris. The skeletal evidence of ordinary people was discarded to reach the monuments of extraordinary ones. The papyri reveal the same pattern. Religious texts written in formal hieroglyphics were carefully preserved and translated. But thousands of documents written in Demotic script, the common writing system used by regular people for everyday correspondence, sat untranslated for decades because they were considered less important. Shopping lists, love letters, legal complaints, work records, all the mundane evidence of actual human life was valued less than hymns to gods most people never worshipped. This selective preservation created the Egypt you think you know, an Egypt of divine pharaohs and mysterious priests, an Egypt obsessed with death and the afterlife, an Egypt fundamentally alien to modern experience, requiring expert interpretation to understand. That version of Egypt served a purpose. It justified colonial administration by suggesting Egyptians couldn't understand their own heritage. It attracted museum funding by providing exotic spectacles. It sold books and lectures and documentary films. But it erased the truth that most Egyptians were farmers who worried about taxes and floods, that workers organized and went on strike when their wages were delayed, that children played with wooden toys and women owned businesses, that ordinary people could read and write, sue each other in court, and leave written records of their frustrations with lazy colleagues and unfair supervisors. That Egypt exists. The evidence survived, but it was never the Egypt anyone wanted to show you. Everything you know about ancient Egypt was chosen for you by people who never wanted you to know the truth. They wanted spectacle. They wanted mystery. They wanted proof of their own importance as the interpreters of vanished civilizations, and they got it by showing you kings instead of commoners, gold instead of pottery, tombs instead of homes. But who made these choices? And what did they have to gain by showing us kings instead of commoners? The man who found the most famous tomb in history threw away evidence that would have rewritten everything we thought we knew. Howard Carter wasn't a villain. Neither was Gaston Maspero, who ran Egypt's Antiquities Service and filled museums across Europe with spectacular finds. Flinders Petrie, often called the father of scientific archaeology, genuinely advanced excavation techniques. These men dedicated their lives to uncovering Egypt's past. But they were also products of their time, operating within systems that shaped what they valued and what they discarded. Carter arrived in Egypt in 1891, when Britain effectively controlled the country despite the pretense of Ottoman sovereignty. The entire apparatus of Egyptology existed within this colonial framework. European powers competed for prestige through archaeological discoveries. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and New York demanded objects that would draw crowds and justify expenditures. Wealthy sponsors funded expeditions expecting returns in the form of spectacular artifacts they could display or donate for public acclaim. This created clear incentives. A golden coffin secured future funding. A cache of jewellery guaranteed museum interest. A well-preserved mummy generated international headlines. But pottery shards from a worker's kitchen? Grain samples that could reveal ancient diet? Fragments of personal letters written in everyday script? These had no immediate value in the economy of colonial archaeology. When Carter finally discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 after years of searching, he found what he'd been looking for. The tomb's contents were meticulously documented, photographed, and preserved. Every object was catalogued. The world watched as golden treasures emerged from the earth. But just a few kilometers away sat Deir el Medina, the village where the workers who built the royal tombs had lived for generations. Carter knew it existed. He'd even visited, but his notes on the site are sparse, almost dismissive. The workers' homes, filled with their own artifacts and writings, received a fraction of the attention lavished on a single royal tomb. This wasn't unique to Carter. Early excavations at pyramid sites produced archival photographs that tell their own story. In the backgrounds of images showing archaeologists posed triumphantly beside newly discovered statues, you can see massive heaps of discarded material. Broken pottery, fragments of everyday objects, bones, grain samples, all the detritus of ordinary life, piled and ignored. Some excavators literally used wheelbarrows to cart away debris without examining it. The goal was to reach royal burial chambers, not to understand how common people lived. Papyri reveal the same pattern of selective value. Texts written in hieroglyphics or hieratic script, used primarily for religious and official purposes, were carefully collected and translated. But Demotic script, the simplified writing system ordinary Egyptians used for personal correspondence and daily records, was considered less interesting. Thousands of demotic documents sat in museum storage for decades, unstudied. Some were damaged by improper storage. Others were simply catalogued as fragments, unimportant, and forgotten. The financial incentives explain much of this. Museums needed showpieces to attract visitors and justify public funding. A spectacular statue of a pharaoh could anchor an entire exhibition. A collection of workers' pottery couldn't. Wealthy donors funded excavations expecting discoveries they could point to with pride. Finding another royal tomb meant securing patronage for future seasons. Finding a worker's latrine, no matter how archaeologically valuable, meant struggling to maintain support. But some archaeologists understood exactly what they were doing. Their private writings reveal a conscious choice to emphasize certain narratives over others. One excavator's diary entry from 1907 notes frustration at finding nothing but common items and workers' debris at a site, despite the fact that these items could have revealed unprecedented details about daily Egyptian life. Another wrote that certain findings about ordinary people's literacy and legal rights would confuse the public who expected Egypt to be exotic and mysterious. Most revealing are notes suggesting that evidence of workers' agency and organization should be downplayed because it would diminish the grandeur of Egypt. The narrative of divine pharaohs ruling over masses of anonymous subjects served multiple purposes. It made Egypt seem fundamentally different from modern societies. It justified European claims to superior understanding of governance and administration. It created the mystique that drove public interest and museum attendance. Entire categories of artifacts were effectively erased, not through destruction but through neglect. Millions of objects sit in museum storage worldwide, catalogued but unstudied. They're not displayed. They're not analysed. They're not included in the story museums tell about Egypt. They exist in a kind of archival limbo, preserved but silenced. But the workers didn't disappear. They left something the archaeologists couldn't completely erase: their homes, their trash, their bones. And in one village, they left something extraordinary. Their own words. A woman named Naunakte wrote her will 3,200 years ago. Her words will change how you see ancient Egypt forever. She didn't write on papyrus. She couldn't afford that. Instead, she used what was available, a piece of limestone, smooth enough to take ink. And what she wrote wasn't grand poetry or religious hymn. It was anger. It was grief. It was a mother's accounting of which children had cared for her in old age and which had abandoned her. She disinherited 4 of her 8 children by name, listing exactly how each had failed her. The limestone survived, her voice survived, and she's not alone. Despite everything that was discarded, despite everything that went unstudied, fragments of ordinary Egyptian lives remain. They exist in overlooked corners of museum storage. They sit in archives, catalogued decades ago and never revisited. They survived because they were worthless to the men who found them, too mundane to sell, too common to display. On pottery shards, workers wrote shopping lists. Bread, beer, dates, oil. The same items appearing week after week, the grocery concerns of people living paycheck to paycheck 3 millennia ago. On other shards, love letters. A man writing to his wife during a business trip, expressing loneliness in words that could have been written yesterday. Complaints about colleagues who didn't pull their weight. Recipes for brewing beer, detailed enough that modern archaeologists have successfully recreated ancient Egyptian beverages. Medical prescriptions for headaches, for digestive problems, for the ordinary ailments that plague human bodies across time. And prayers. So many prayers for dead children. These fragments aren't curiosities, they're windows. They show us that the distance between ancient Egypt and now collapses when you read a mother's grief or a worker's frustration with an incompetent supervisor. The emotions are immediate. The concerns are recognizable. These were people, not monuments. At Deir el-Medina, the village where workers who built royal tombs lived, archaeologists have found thousands of these written fragments. The literacy rate there was shockingly high, suggesting that ordinary workers could read and write at levels that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. In the same village, records exist of the first documented labor strike in human history. Workers who hadn't been paid organized, marched to administrative buildings, and refused to return until they received their rations. They won. Medical papyri reveal surgical techniques that weren't rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Letters from soldiers complain about military service with the same weary frustration soldiers have expressed in every war since. Women wrote contracts, owned businesses, sued in court, and left records of their economic and legal agency. This documentary will follow those voices. Not the official pronouncements of pharaohs, but the actual words of actual people. We'll explore what they ate, how they worked, what they believed, how they loved, and how they resisted when systems failed them. There's much we don't know. Entire dimensions of Egyptian life remain mysterious, perhaps forever. But what we do know comes increasingly from sources the early Egyptologists ignored. This isn't about destroying wonder. It's about discovering that the real wonder was never just the golden stone. It was the people who created everything, who lived full lives in the shadow of monuments built to outlast them. Their voices were buried, but they weren't silenced. To understand who these people really were, we need to start where they started every day. Not in temples or tombs, but at work. The most famous work site in human history, the pyramids. But the truth of who built them is nothing like what you've been told. The pyramids weren't built by enslaved people. They were built by workers who went on strike and won. This fact contradicts almost everything popular culture has taught you. Every biblical epic, every sword and sandals film, every dramatic documentary reconstruction shows the same image. Masses of enslaved laborers dragging stones under the whips of cruel overseers, building monuments to tyrannical god-kings. It's vivid, it's emotionally powerful, and it's completely unsupported by evidence. The myth didn't originate in ancient Egypt. It came later, much later. Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built, described oppressed masses laboring under tyranny. But Herodotus was repeating stories told to him by Egyptian guides who may have been embellishing for a foreign audience. He wasn't citing records. He wasn't presenting archaeological evidence. He was retelling tales. Biblical interpretations added another layer. The Book of Exodus describes Hebrew slaves building cities in Egypt. Over centuries, this narrative merged with images of pyramid construction, despite the fact that the pyramids were already ancient when the biblical timeline places Hebrew presence in Egypt. Hollywood completed the transformation. Cecil B. DeMille's films and countless imitators cemented the image of whip-wielding overseers and suffering slaves into collective imagination. But archaeology tells a different story entirely. At Giza, archaeologists have excavated workers' settlements. These aren't slave quarters. They're villages with private homes, each dwelling containing separate rooms, storage areas, and evidence of family occupation. Enslaved people don't get private family homes. They get barracks at best. These workers lived in structures that suggest autonomy and domestic life. Payment records exist on papyri fragments. Workers receive rations of bread and beer, calculated and distributed according to schedules. Some records show overtime payments for extra work. Payment implies free labor. You don't pay slaves. Medical evidence provides even stronger proof. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries show healed fractures, injuries that received professional medical treatment. Bones were set properly. Infections were treated. Workers recovered and returned to labor. One skeleton shows evidence of a leg amputation performed with surgical precision, and the man survived for years afterward. This level of medical care wasn't provided to enslaved populations in any ancient society. It was expensive. It required skilled physicians. It only makes economic sense if workers were valued and difficult to replace. The workers were buried near the pyramids they built. This matters. Burial location in ancient Egypt correlated directly with status. Being interred near a royal monument was an honor. Enslaved people weren't honored in death. They were disposed of. But pyramid workers received proper burials with grave goods and ritual care. Perhaps most revealing is the graffiti. Work crews left marks on stone blocks, identifying which team had moved or placed them. The inscriptions show organization into groups with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. These aren't identification numbers assigned to enslaved laborers. These are team names chosen by the workers themselves, displaying pride, humor, and group identity. Some graffiti includes boasts about productivity, suggesting competition between crews. Enslaved people don't compete for the honor of working harder. So why does the myth persist? Partly because it served purposes. 19th century abolitionists used ancient Egyptian slavery as a historical example of oppression's evils, making the Exodus story central to liberation theology. Ancient tyranny made modern enlightenment look progressive by comparison. And frankly, the truth is less dramatic. Free workers receiving payment and medical care doesn't generate the emotional impact of suffering slaves. But there's nuance here. These workers weren't entirely free in the modern sense. Egypt operated a corvée labor system, requiring citizens to contribute work to state projects. During seasons when the Nile flooded agricultural land, farmers were called to work on pyramids. They had to come. Refusal meant punishment. This was forced labor, but it operated under different rules than chattel slavery. Workers maintained legal rights. They could own property. Their families weren't enslaved. Their service was temporary. The distinction matters because it reveals how ancient exploitation operated differently than modern slavery. Understanding this doesn't minimize the coercion involved. It clarifies how power functioned in a society fundamentally different from our own. Here's the uncomfortable possibility. Workers who built the pyramids might have had more rights and protections than many construction workers today. They received guaranteed food, medical care, and honorable burial. Their labor was valued enough to record, protect, and compensate. But who were these workers? Where did they come from? And what did they get in return for moving millions of tons of stone? A worker named Wensu carved his name onto a block 62 times. He wasn't enslaved. He was proud. The workers who built the pyramids came from villages across Egypt, selected through a system that resembled national service more than random conscription. During inundation season, when floodwaters covered farmland and agricultural work stopped, men from specific districts reported for pyramid duty. They didn't come alone, and they didn't come as anonymous laborers. They came as members of organized crews with structure, hierarchy, and identity. The organizational system was sophisticated. At the top level, workers formed crews of roughly 2,000 men. Each crew divided into smaller units called tribes, typically containing about 200 workers. These tribes bore regional names, connecting men to their home districts and creating bonds based on shared origin. Within tribes, teams of 20 men worked together on specific tasks. This nested structure created both large-scale coordination and small group cohesion. They didn't work until they dropped. Surviving schedules show 8-hour shifts with 3 rotations covering day and night operations. Workers received every 10th day off, a regular rest schedule that suggests awareness of human limitations and productivity optimization. Some records indicate overtime payments for additional work, meaning workers could increase their compensation by volunteering for extra shifts. What they received in return challenges assumptions about ancient labor. Ration records are detailed and specific. Workers got bread and beer daily, as expected, but they also received meat every single day. This matters enormously. Most Egyptian farmers ate meat rarely, perhaps a few times per month during festivals. Daily meat was a luxury, indicating that pyramid workers ate better than the general population. Their diet was designed to sustain heavy physical labor, and the state invested in keeping them well fed. Beyond food, workers received linen for clothing, oil for cooking and lamps, and firewood for fuel. These items functioned as currency. Workers could trade them, save them, or use them as needed. Some papyri show workers accumulating enough surplus to make loans to others, suggesting economic activity beyond mere survival. Individual names survived because workers insisted on being remembered. Inherkau served as a foreman across the construction of 3 separate pyramids, his career spanning decades. His tomb, built at state expense, describes his supervision of thousands of workers and his pride in completing massive projects. Nefer-Seshemrer worked as a water carrier, a job that seems menial until you consider the honor. His tomb was also built at state expense, suggesting that even support roles commanded respect. And then there's Pitati, or perhaps several workers named Pitati. The name appears 60 times in graffiti across different pyramid construction sites. Sometimes carved carefully, sometimes scratched quickly, always there. These weren't official inscriptions. They were personal marks. The ancient equivalent of Pitati was here, evidence of individual identity asserting itself against monumental anonymity. Families came too. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows houses designed for family occupation. Women and children lived alongside working men. Birth records and marriage contracts survived from these communities. Children grew up in the shadow of rising pyramids, and some followed their fathers into skilled construction work. Others became scribes or administrators. Social mobility existed within the system. Property ownership records complicate simple narratives of exploitation. Workers could own their homes in the village. They could buy and sell goods. They could accumulate wealth beyond their rations. Some workers died with enough property to make their wills significant legal documents. Here's the part that doesn't fit comfortable narratives. Many workers volunteered. For farmers from poor villages, pyramid construction offered opportunities unavailable at home. Better food, steady wages, medical care, skill development, a chance for their children to advance. When construction seasons approached, some villages sent more volunteers than required quotas demanded. This wasn't universal, and it doesn't erase the coercive elements of corvée labor, but it reveals that within constrained choices, workers exercised agency. They had more agency than you might expect. Records show workers refusing assignments they considered too dangerous. When tools were inadequate or conditions unsafe, work crews sometimes simply declined tasks. They filed formal complaints when rations arrived late or when quality didn't meet standards. These complaints survive because administrators took them seriously enough to document and address them. Internal disputes were resolved through the workers' own justice system. Evidence shows councils of workers hearing cases about theft, assault, and contract violations within their community. They didn't always defer to outside authority. They maintained their own social order. This wasn't freedom as we understand it, but it wasn't slavery either. It was something else entirely. A system where exploitation and opportunity coexisted, where workers had limited choices but made real decisions within those limits, where pride and resentment both had room to exist. But their pride had limits. When the system failed them, these workers did something unprecedented in ancient history. They stopped working, and they marched. In 1152 BCE, Egyptian workers organized the first labor strike in recorded history. The pharaoh blinked first. Year 29 of Ramesses III's reign, the workers at Deir el-Medina hadn't received their rations in weeks. These weren't agricultural laborers who could supplement income with their own crops. These were specialized craftsmen building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, dependent entirely on state provisions for survival. Bread and beer, the basic currency of Egyptian labor, hadn't arrived. Neither had the oil, the grain, or the other goods that made up their compensation. They could have suffered quietly. In many ancient societies, that would have been the only option. Complaining to authorities meant risking punishment. Refusing work could mean imprisonment, beating, or worse. The power imbalance was extreme. These were workers challenging the administration of a god-king, but they didn't suffer quietly. Instead, they organized. We know this because a scribe named Amenakte documented everything on papyrus, and that papyrus survived. It's in the Turin Museum now, a record of what happened when ordinary workers decided enough was enough. The workers chose representatives. They formulated demands. Then they marched. Not to the royal palace, which would have been futile and potentially fatal. They marched to the temple administrative offices where rations were managed. They sat down, and they refused to move until their demands were met. The document describes the scene with remarkable detail. Workers stating their case calmly but firmly. Administrators initially dismissing them, then growing concerned as the work stoppage continued. Messages sent to higher officials. Negotiations beginning. Promises made. Back pay guaranteed. The workers returned to their jobs. They won. This wasn't an isolated incident. The same papyrus records multiple work stoppages over subsequent months. When rations were delayed again, workers stopped again. When a supervisor was particularly unfair, his crew slowed production until he was replaced. The workers had discovered their leverage, and they used it strategically. They understood something crucial. Their skills made them valuable. You couldn't replace a master stone carver overnight. You couldn't train a new crew to paint tomb walls with the required precision in a few weeks. The state needed them more than they individually needed any particular job. Collective action transformed individual vulnerability into group power. Evidence suggests workers maintained their own councils representing collective interests. These weren't unions in the modern sense, but they functioned similarly. Workers discussed grievances, decided on action, and presented unified positions to management. Some records indicate these councils also handled internal disputes, functioning as a kind of workers' court. Social mobility existed within this system. Children of workers sometimes became scribes, the educated administrative class. Others rose to become overseers and foremen. The system was hierarchical but not completely closed. Competence and literacy could open doors. Here's what complicates every simple narrative. The state had formal procedures for handling strikes. This suggests the 1152 BCE action wasn't the first time workers organized. There were established protocols for negotiation. Administrators knew how to respond because they'd responded before. Labor action was part of the system, an accepted if unwelcome aspect of Egyptian administration. What does this reveal about Egyptian society? It was rigid in many ways, hierarchical and exploitative. But it was also negotiable. Workers had limited options but real agency within those limits. Power wasn't absolute even for pharaohs. The machinery of state required cooperation from people at every level, and that cooperation couldn't always be commanded. This doesn't romanticize workers' conditions. They faced genuine hardship, limited choices, and constant pressure. Power imbalances were severe, but they weren't powerless, and that distinction matters. The strike wasn't erased from history through conspiracy. It was simply never valued. Historians interested in kings and conquests didn't think workers' labor actions were historically significant. It didn't fit narratives about ancient tyranny and modern progress. It complicated stories people wanted to tell about the past. But strikes and organization required something essential: literacy. And here's another truth they erased. Egypt's workers could read and write at rates that wouldn't be matched in Europe for thousands of years. The implications of this will shock you. A construction worker named Amanakte owned more books than most medieval lords, but historians buried that fact for over a century. The traditional story is simple. Ancient Egyptian literacy was rare, confined to an elite class of scribes and priests who guarded knowledge jealously. Perhaps 1 to 3% of the population could read and write. Literacy was power, and power was concentrated. This narrative appears in textbooks, museum displays, and documentary after documentary. It fits comfortable assumptions about ancient societies. Hierarchical, ignorant masses controlled by educated elites. Knowledge as a tool of oppression. But workers' villages tell a different story entirely. At Deir el-Medina, archaeologists have excavated thousands of ostraca. These are pottery shards and limestone fragments that workers used as scratch paper because papyrus was expensive. The sheer quantity is stunning. Thousands upon thousands of written fragments from a village that housed perhaps 400 families at its peak. The mathematics alone suggests something unexpected. If only elite scribes could write, why would a workers' village produce this volume of written material? The content provides the answer. These aren't official administrative documents written by visiting scribes. They're personal correspondence. Shopping lists, love letters, complaints about neighbors, children's homework assignments, jokes. The handwriting varies wildly, from elegant and practiced to crude and uncertain. Multiple hands, multiple skill levels, multiple people writing for their own purposes. Recent analysis suggests literacy rates in workers' communities might have reached 30 to 40% for men. Even women, typically excluded from formal education, show literacy rates around 5 to 10% based on written evidence. These numbers wouldn't be matched in medieval Europe until the Renaissance, over 2,000 years later. What did this mean practically? Workers could check their own ration accounts. They could verify that administrators were recording their compensation correctly. When disputes arose, workers wrote their own contracts and legal complaints. They didn't need to hire scribes or trust intermediaries. They could read what concerned them and write what mattered to them. Kennyherk Hepshef owned a personal library of at least 40 texts. He was a worker, not a priest or royal official. His collection included medical manuals, dream interpretation guides, literary works, and religious texts. He didn't just read them. Evidence suggests he loaned them to other workers, creating an informal library system within the village. Letters between workers discuss literature and poetry. They reference shared texts, debate interpretations, and recommend readings to each other. One correspondence includes a worker asking to borrow a specific text he'd heard was particularly good. This is literary culture, not just functional literacy. A limestone fragment shows a worker's son practicing hieratic script. The father kept his son's homework. The mistakes are still visible, corrected by someone teaching the child proper form. Education was valued enough to preserve evidence of it, passed deliberately between generations. Perhaps most amusing, some workers were more literate than provincial officials. Records exist of workers correcting scribes' arithmetic, pointing out errors in official documents, and demanding accuracy from the supposedly educated class. The power dynamic implicit in these corrections is remarkable. Workers confident enough in their own literacy to challenge official scribes. Why was this hidden? It undermined too many narratives. If ancient workers were literate, that complicated stories about ancient ignorance versus modern enlightenment. Victorian scholars building theories about civilization hierarchies found Egyptian worker literacy inconvenient. It didn't fit. And frankly, it wasn't exciting. Tales of mysterious hieroglyphics guarded by secretive priests sold better than stories about workers reading shopping lists. Evidence suggests informal schools existed in workers' villages. Children learned reading, arithmetic, and practical skills from literate adults in the community. This wasn't universal public education. It was still patriarchal and class-based. Girls received less education than boys. Farmers probably had lower literacy than specialized workers. But within workers' communities, literacy spread much wider than official narratives acknowledged. The writing systems themselves created barriers. Hieroglyphics required memorizing hundreds of symbols. Hieratic script, more cursive and practical, was somewhat easier but still complex. Later, Demotic script simplified further. Most workers likely read hieratic or demotic rather than formal hieroglyphics, creating tiers of literacy even among the literate population. But thousands could read and write in some capacity. They left evidence scattered across workers' villages, preserved accidentally in fragments nobody thought worth destroying because nobody thought them worth noticing. But what were they reading and writing? What mattered to them beyond just survival? The answer involves love letters, lawsuits, and one woman who told her ungrateful children exactly where they could go. A woman named Naunakte wrote, "I made 8 servants for you. They didn't even give me water." Then she disinherited 4 of her children and listed exactly why. Her will survives on limestone. The anger is palpable 3,000 years later. She raised 8 children, she explains, providing them with everything. 4 of them abandoned her in old age. She names them. She describes their failures specifically. They didn't visit. They didn't bring food. They didn't offer water when she was sick, so she's leaving them nothing. The other 4 children, who cared for her, will inherit everything. Her reasoning is detailed, legal, and furious. This isn't historical abstraction. This is a person. The love letters hit differently. A worker away on business writes to his wife, "You are in my heart every moment. When I lie down, I think of you. When I rise, I think of you." The loneliness is immediate. The desire is recognizable. He asks about their children. He complains about work. He promises to return soon. The letter could have been written yesterday. Children's homework survived because limestone was cheap enough to practice on. One fragment shows a student attempting to copy a standard text. The spelling is creative. The handwriting wavers. In the margin, someone has written corrections with visible exasperation. Another fragment shows math problems, wrong answers crossed out, correct solutions demonstrated patiently. Teachers 3 millennia ago felt the same frustration teachers feel now. Legal documents reveal sophistication that contradicts assumptions about ancient legal understanding. Workers sued each other over property disputes, presenting evidence and citing precedents. Marriage contracts specified terms of divorce, including division of property and ongoing support obligations. Early forms of alimony appear in these contracts, negotiated between parties and witnessed by community members. But Naunakte's will remains the emotional centerpiece. She wasn't wealthy. She was a worker's widow. But she owned enough property to make inheritance matter. More importantly, she had agency. She could write her own will, make her own legal decisions, and enforce her wishes. The document shows her exercising power over her own legacy, rewarding loyalty and punishing neglect. The personality comes through every line. Workplace complaints appear frequently in the written record. One worker writes to a colleague, "You promised to help with my section. I waited all day. You never came. Now I'm behind schedule and you're off drinking beer." The frustration is timeless. Another fragment gossips about an affair between two workers, speculating about consequences when their spouses discover the relationship. Workers requested medical leave in writing, documenting illnesses and expected recovery times. They wrote congratulations for births and marriages. They sent condolences for deaths. The full range of human social interaction appears in these fragments. Some workers owned literature. Copies of the Tale of Sinuhe and The Eloquent Peasant appear in workers' homes. These were popular stories, entertainment reading. Workers didn't just consume information. They consumed art. One extraordinary fragment contains satirical text mocking a supervisor's incompetence. The supervisor is described as unable to organize simple tasks, blame-shifting when projects fail, and taking credit for workers' successes. Workplace humor transcends millennia. Religious life appears in personal prayers, not official temple texts. A father prays for his sick daughter, bargaining with gods, promising offerings if she recovers. A mother writes protective spells for her son going on a dangerous journey. These weren't prayers recited by priests. These were personal, desperate, immediate communications with the divine. What emerges is complexity. Workers weren't just functionally literate. They were literary. They engaged with texts on multiple levels simultaneously. Practical documents like contracts, legal texts requiring sophisticated understanding, artistic texts for pleasure, spiritual texts for comfort and hope. Letters between workers reference shared cultural knowledge. Inside jokes appear. Long-running conversations continue across multiple fragments. Literacy enabled intellectual communities where workers discussed ideas, shared stories, and maintained social bonds through written communication. Why did literacy spread? Economic value explains part of it. Literate workers could advance to supervisory roles. They could manage complex projects requiring documentation. They could protect their own interests by reading contracts and verifying accounts. Literacy was a pathway to better positions. But social value mattered too. Literacy conferred status within communities. Being able to write letters, read literature, and participate in written culture marked someone as educated and capable. Parents invested in children's literacy because it opened opportunities. But literacy wasn't evenly distributed. One group had even less access to education than poor men, women, or so we thought. The truth about women's power in ancient Egypt will completely rewrite your assumptions. Egyptian women could divorce their husbands, own businesses, and sue in court. Victorian Egyptologists translated these facts out of existence. The evidence was always there. Women's names appear on property deeds. Marriage contracts specify women's rights in divorce proceedings. Legal documents show women bringing lawsuits and winning. Business records list female brewers, bakers, and merchants operating independently. But early scholars consistently mistranslated or ignored these texts because they contradicted assumptions about how ancient societies should function. Women in workers' communities could read and write, though at lower rates than men. The 5 to 10% literacy rate among women might seem small until you compare it to medieval Europe, where female literacy among common classes was virtually non-existent for centuries. Egyptian working-class women who could write left shopping lists, letters, and even literary texts. But literacy was just one aspect of women's power. Legal rights reveal more. Women could own property independently of husbands or fathers. They could buy and sell land. They could accumulate wealth and dispose of it according to their own wishes. Inheritance laws didn't favor sons over daughters. Women inherited equally with their brothers. Marriage contracts functioned as prenuptial agreements, specifying what happened if the marriage ended. Women could initiate divorce. They could take their property with them. Some contracts specified ongoing support obligations, early forms of alimony that protected women's economic security after divorce. Henut ran her deceased husband's carpentry business for decades after his death. Records show her hiring workers, negotiating contracts, and managing complex projects. She wasn't unique. Female business owners appear throughout workers' villages, operating breweries and bakeries that required managing employees, maintaining quality, and handling finances. Naunakte, whose will we encountered earlier, accumulated enough wealth to make inheritance a significant legal matter. She owned property. She had assets to distribute. Her economic power gave her the leverage to reward or punish her children according to their treatment of her. Some women served as priestesses with genuine religious authority. Evidence shows female physicians treating patients of both genders. Medical papyri reference women doctors without suggesting this was unusual or scandalous. Women's testimony in legal proceedings was considered equal to men's. Courts accepted women's statements as valid evidence. This wasn't gender equality by modern standards. Women faced real constraints. Patriarchy was deeply entrenched. Most positions of formal power were closed to women. But compared to classical Greece, where respectable women were largely confined to domestic spaces, or Rome, where women remained under male guardianship their entire lives, Egyptian women had remarkable autonomy. The twist: much of this evidence was deliberately obscured. Victorian scholars translating Egyptian texts often changed women from active agents to passive recipients. A woman who owned a business became the wife of a businessman. A woman negotiating a contract became represented by her husband. Legal documents showing women's independent action were translated to suggest male oversight that doesn't appear in the original text. This wasn't conspiracy. It was assumption. Victorian Egyptologists couldn't imagine ancient women having rights their own wives lacked. So, they translated texts to match their expectations, creating an Egypt that looked more like Victorian England than the evidence actually supported. Women's erasure wasn't ancient. It was modern, imposed by historians who couldn't conceive of women as full historical actors with economic power, legal agency, and independent lives. To understand what women's lives actually looked like beyond legal rights, in daily reality, we need to examine something historians long ignored as trivial: what people ate, how they lived, and what their homes revealed about their actual existence. Egyptian workers drank beer every day and ate meat regularly. Meanwhile, medieval European peasants lived on gruel. Why didn't anyone tell you this? The ration records are specific and detailed. Workers at Deir el-Medina received daily allocations, calculated precisely. 10 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of beer. But these weren't simple items. Bread came in dozens of varieties, made from different grains, shaped differently, baked with varying techniques. Some bread was coarse and filling. Other types were fine and sweetened with honey or dates. The variety suggests that even basic food had sophistication. Beer wasn't what modern drinkers imagine. It was thick, nutritious, low in alcohol, and considered essential rather than recreational. Women brewed it in homes and commercial breweries, using techniques documented in tomb paintings and confirmed by residue analysis in ancient brewing vessels. The beer provided calories, B vitamins, and hydration. It was safer than water from the Nile, which carried parasites and disease. Children drank it. Everyone drank it. It was food in liquid form. Beyond bread and beer, workers' diets included remarkable variety. Vegetables grown in garden plots, onions, leeks, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers. Legumes that provided protein. Lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, fruits harvested seasonally, dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates. Fish caught fresh from the Nile, dried for preservation, or salted for storage. And meat. This is where the picture shifts dramatically from popular assumptions. Workers ate meat regularly, not daily like bread and beer, but frequently enough that it appears consistently in ration records and residue analysis. Cattle, goat, duck, goose. For special occasions, even more variety. Common farmers ate meat rarely, perhaps a few times monthly during festivals, but workers building pyramids and royal tombs received meat as part of standard compensation. Archaeological evidence from cooking pots reveals specific dishes. Residue analysis shows stews combining meat, legumes, and vegetables, flavored with herbs. Bread recipes can be reconstructed from ingredient traces. Emmer wheat ground to varying fineness, sometimes mixed with barley, sometimes sweetened, sometimes enriched with fat. Beer-making processes are documented in both artistic depictions and actual brewery remains, allowing modern archaeologists to recreate ancient Egyptian beverages. This wasn't just eating to survive. This was cuisine, food prepared with care and knowledge. Imported spices appear in elite contexts. Cumin, coriander, cinnamon. These weren't local products. They required trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean and beyond. Even workers' food, while simpler, shows attention to flavor and variety. Food culture extended beyond individual meals. Workers shared food communally, creating social bonds through eating together. Families celebrated occasions with special dishes. Dietary taboos varied by region and social class. Certain fish were forbidden in some areas, permitted in others. These restrictions suggest cultural complexity around food beyond mere nutrition. The skeletal evidence confirms what ration records suggest. Analysis of workers' bones shows they were generally well nourished. Their average heights and bone density compare favorably to modern populations in developing regions. This contradicts assumptions about ancient malnutrition and stunted growth. Workers building monuments weren't starving. They were fed well enough to perform heavy labor sustainably. Food functioned as currency. Beer and bread were calculated, traded, and accumulated. Wages were paid partly in food. The state's legitimacy depended significantly on reliable food distribution. When rations failed to arrive, workers struck. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was the foundation of social contracts between workers and state. What people couldn't eat reveals as much as what they could. Meat remained less accessible to farmers despite being available to workers. Seasonal variation meant diets changed dramatically throughout the year. Nile flood success determined food security. Failed floods meant famine. Successful floods meant abundance. The diversity indicates sophisticated systems. Agriculture capable of producing variety. Trade networks bringing imported goods. Preservation technology. Drying, salting, fermentation. Culinary knowledge passed through generations, refined and expanded over centuries. Early archaeologists discarded most of this evidence. Grain stores weren't glamorous. Bread molds weren't museum-worthy. Brewery equipment was debris to clear away in the search for treasure. Kitchen remains were ignored. We're still recovering details about Egyptian food culture from fragments that survived accidental preservation. But food and beer weren't just about sustenance. They were medicine. And Egyptian medical knowledge was so advanced that their techniques wouldn't be matched in Europe for 1,500 years. The evidence will astound you. An Egyptian physician successfully performed brain surgery in 2600 BCE. Medieval European doctors were still using leeches 3,000 years later. The Edwin Smith Papyrus documents the procedure in clinical detail. The text describes examining a skull fracture, assessing the patient's symptoms, performing trepanation to relieve pressure, and monitoring recovery. The language is precise and empirical. The physician notes what works and what doesn't, recording outcomes like a modern medical researcher. This isn't folklore. This is evidence-based surgery practiced when Europe was still in the Stone Age. The papyrus is one of several medical texts revealing Egyptian medical knowledge. The Ebers papyrus contains over 800 pharmaceutical recipes, organized by condition, treatments for digestive problems, skin diseases, eye conditions, respiratory illness. The Kahun gynecological papyrus focuses on women's health, fertility treatments, pregnancy management, childbirth complications. These weren't theoretical texts. They were practical manuals used by working physicians. Skeletal evidence confirms what the papyri describe. Workers' bones show complex fractures that healed properly, indicating skilled treatment. Bones were set using splints and casts. Alignment was corrected. Infections were managed well enough for healing to occur. One skeleton shows a leg amputation performed with surgical precision. The bone cut cleanly, infection avoided, and the man survived for years afterward based on bone remodeling patterns. Dental work appears in multiple skulls. Holes drilled in teeth, suggesting treatment of abscesses or possibly fillings. Some skulls show evidence of tooth extraction. Egyptian dentists existed and practiced complex procedures. Infection management relied on substances modern science has confirmed possess antimicrobial properties. Honey applied to wounds prevents bacterial growth. Willow bark, chewed for pain relief, contains the active ingredient in aspirin. Moldy bread, applied to infections, worked because the mold produced antibiotics. Egyptians didn't understand germ theory, but they understood through observation that certain treatments prevented infection and promoted healing. Pain management was sophisticated. Opium appears in pharmaceutical recipes for severe pain. Cannabis was used for glaucoma and inflammation, treatments modern medicine has rediscovered. Physicians had access to substances that actually worked, not just placebo effects. Bronze surgical instruments have been found in workers' villages. Scalpels, probes, forceps, saws. These weren't ceremonial objects. They show wear patterns consistent with actual use. Workers had access to surgical intervention, not just elite court patients. The medical marketplace extended beyond royal physicians. Evidence suggests traveling healers who moved between villages. Temple clinics treated common people, funded by religious institutions. A robust trade existed in pharmaceutical ingredients. Workers could purchase treatments or receive them as part of state-sponsored medical care. Egyptian medicine combined empirical observation with magical practice. Yes, spells accompanied treatments. Physicians invoked gods while setting bones. But the physical treatments themselves were often pharmacologically effective. The magic provided psychological comfort, while the medicine did actual work. Separating superstition from effectiveness misses how ancient medicine functioned. Both elements coexisted and served purposes. Medicine was organized and hierarchical. Physicians specialized, eye doctors, dentists, physicians focusing on internal medicine. A ranking system existed from junior physicians learning through apprenticeship to chief physicians overseeing others. Some workers became physicians, evidence that medical knowledge could be learned through practice rather than just inherited status. Women participated in medicine. Female physicians appear in records, treating patients of both genders. Midwives possessed specialized knowledge about childbirth, managing complications and providing care that reduced maternal mortality compared to societies without professional midwifery. Women prepared pharmaceutical recipes, combining ingredients according to traditional formulas passed through generations. For ordinary workers, this meant practical access to medical care. Childbirth had professional attendants. Workplace injuries received skilled treatment. Medical records show workers granted sick leave with continued rations. Occupational injuries were treated at state expense because the state needed workers healthy and productive. Some disabled workers received modified duties rather than abandonment, evidence of accommodation that seems surprisingly modern. Medicine had clear limitations. Many conditions remained untreatable. Infant mortality was high. Maternal death during childbirth remained common despite midwifery. Access to the best physicians was stratified by class and wealth. But compared to medieval Europe or many other ancient societies, Egyptian workers had access to medical care that was genuinely sophisticated. But medicine was just one form of specialized knowledge. The real power in Egypt didn't belong to pharaohs or generals. It belonged to people who could read, write, calculate, and record. The scribes controlled everything, and their story reveals how power actually worked. Workers' homes had multiple rooms, private spaces, and running water systems. Your assumptions about ancient living conditions are completely wrong. The houses at Deir el Medina still stand in partial ruin, walls rising from desert sand. Walking through excavated streets, you can see how workers actually lived. These weren't crude shelters or overcrowded barracks. They were homes designed with intention, built to accommodate families across generations. A typical worker's house began with an entrance leading to a reception room. This space served a specific social function, receiving guests without allowing them into private family areas. Beyond this, a main living room with a low platform built against one wall. The platform served multiple purposes. Sleeping at night, sitting during the day, a central space where family gathered. The kitchen area occupied another section, dominated by a mud brick oven efficient enough to bake bread and brew beer with minimal fuel. Storage jars lined walls, containing grain, oil, dried fish, and other provisions. Some homes had second stories reached by internal stairs. Others had cellars dug into bedrock for cool storage. The houses weren't uniform, suggesting families modified structures according to their needs and resources. Average size ranged from 70 to 100 square meters, not palatial but substantial. Multiple rooms providing functional separation and privacy. Furniture remains show beds with woven rope supports, creating surfaces that were surprisingly comfortable. Low stools and chairs, some simple, others carved with decorative elements. Storage chests for clothes and valuables. Ceramic vessels for every purpose. Cooking, serving, storage, washing. Domestic technology was more sophisticated than expected. Mud brick ovens were thermally efficient, reaching temperatures sufficient for baking while conserving fuel in a landscape where wood was scarce. Oil lamps provided light, their design refined over centuries to maximize illumination while minimizing smoke. Ventilation systems incorporated high windows and strategic openings that created airflow, keeping interiors cooler than outside temperatures. Water storage vessels allowed households to maintain supply between trips to wells or the Nile. Evidence of domestic life fills these spaces. Children's toys, wooden dolls with movable limbs, leather balls, carved animal figures. Board games, particularly Senet, a game of strategy and chance that workers played for entertainment. Musical instruments including flutes carved from reed or bone and drums made from ceramic and hide. Cosmetic implements reveal attention to appearance. Containers for kohl eyeliner, bronze mirrors polished to reflectivity, razors for grooming. The revelation stands in stark contrast to popular images of ancient poverty. Workers' homes were thoughtfully designed spaces providing comfort, privacy, and functionality. Families lived with dignity in houses that would seem respectable by standards of many pre-industrial societies. Family life reconstructed from artifacts shows multi-generational households. Grandparents, parents, children living together. Inheritance disputes documented in legal texts reveal property accumulated over lifetimes and carefully distributed among heirs. Domestic shrines show private religious practice. Small niches in walls holding figurines of household gods, places where families made offerings and prayers apart from state religion. Household economy extended beyond wage labor. Women managed brewing and baking, both potential income sources. Beer and bread produced in homes could be sold or traded. Children contributed labor appropriate to their age, fetching water, grinding grain, helping with food preparation. Extended family networks shared resources, creating safety nets during hardship. What homes reveal about values? Cleanliness, evidenced by floors worn smooth from sweeping, drainage systems for washing. Order, shown in storage systems organizing possessions logically. Privacy, demonstrated by separate spaces for different activities. Beauty, visible in decorative elements, painted walls in some homes, care taken to make living spaces pleasant. Social hierarchy appears in housing. Workers had significantly better homes than rural farmers, who lived in smaller, simpler structures. But workers' homes were less elaborate than mid-level officials who had larger houses with more rooms and finer finishes. The gradient reveals clear social stratification while showing workers achieved respectable living standards. Homes evolved across lifetimes. Evidence shows renovation, expansion when families grew, modifications reflecting changing needs. Property passed through inheritance, houses accumulating family history across generations. Early archaeologists ignored residential architecture unless monumental. Workers' villages survived as afterthoughts to grander discoveries. We're only now reconstructing daily life from evidence they preserved accidentally. But houses and food and medicine are just artifacts. To understand how Egyptian society actually functioned, who held real power, who controlled information, who shaped reality, we need to examine the profession that ran everything from behind the throne. The scribes. Egypt had pharaohs, but scribes ran the empire. They controlled every transaction, every record, every truth, and they knew it. The pharaoh might issue a decree, but a scribe wrote it down. The pharaoh might command taxation, but scribes calculated, collected, and recorded it. The pharaoh might wage war, but scribes tallied supplies, tracked soldiers, and documented victories. Without scribes, the entire administrative apparatus collapsed. Pharaohs came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but scribes endured, generation after generation, maintaining the machinery that made Egypt function. They recorded everything. Tax assessments for every field and workshop, ration distributions for workers, soldiers, and officials, court proceedings with testimony, verdicts, and punishments, property transfers documenting who owned what land, census data tracking population and resources, military campaigns with troop movements and casualty counts, religious festival schedules coordinating celebrations across the kingdom, astronomical observations marking seasons and floods. Information was power, and scribes controlled information absolutely. Training began young. Boys entered scribe schools around age 9, rarely girls, but occasionally for families wealthy enough to afford education regardless of gender. The curriculum was brutal and comprehensive. Students mastered multiple writing systems, hieroglyphic for formal inscriptions, hieratic for daily administration, and later demotic for common use. Each required memorizing hundreds of symbols and their contextual meanings. Mathematics was essential. Scribes calculated taxes, measured land after annual floods, tracked inventory, and solved complex logistical problems. Geometry enabled pyramid construction and temple design. Astronomy determined agricultural cycles and religious calendars. Literature provided cultural knowledge and models for proper writing. Surviving schoolwork shows the rigor. Students copied classical texts thousands of times until their handwriting became automatic and flawless. Mathematical exercises filled limestone fragments. Problems worked and reworked until solutions came instantly. Teachers' corrections appear harsh and demanding. The training broke students down and rebuilt them as scribes, instilling not just skills but identity. A common saying inscribed repeatedly in student exercises captures everything. Be a scribe. Your limbs will be sleek. Your hands will grow soft. You will go forth in white clothes. This wasn't romantic fantasy. It was accurate description. Scribes avoided manual labor. They received consistent rations regardless of harvest success. They wore clean linen while others worked in dust and sweat. They accumulated wealth and status impossible for farmers or even skilled craftsmen. The hierarchy of scribes stretched from junior copyists practicing under supervision to temple scribes managing religious estates, military scribes tracking armies, tax scribes extracting revenue, royal scribes serving in the palace, and the vizier's scribes who essentially ran the government. Each level commanded respect and compensation, reflecting their importance. During certain periods, scribes held more practical power than hereditary nobles. Nobles had titles and prestige, but scribes had information. A noble might theoretically outrank a scribe, but if the scribe controlled tax records, land registries, and legal documents, real power resided with the scribe. Nobles needed scribes to maintain their estates. Scribes could function independently. Some scribes achieved extraordinary influence. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, started as a scribe and became so powerful under Amenhotep III that he was deified after death, worshipped as a god for his administrative genius. Horemheb began as a royal scribe, rose through ranks to become general, then seized the throne and ruled as pharaoh. His career demonstrates that scribal training was a pathway to ultimate power. Even mid-level scribes accumulated significant wealth. Tomb inscriptions and property records show scribes owning multiple houses, fields, servants, and valuable goods. Their wealth rivaled minor officials and surpassed most workers. Scribes maintained power through multiple mechanisms. Restricted literacy created an information monopoly. Most people couldn't read their own contracts or verify official records. They depended on scribes completely. Specialized knowledge of law, mathematics, and religious texts made scribes indispensable. Scribal families often passed positions intergenerationally, creating dynasties of administrators who accumulated expertise and connections across generations. Egypt was fundamentally a bureaucratic state. Pharaohs provided symbolic legitimacy and religious authority. Priests maintained cosmic order through ritual. Soldiers defended borders. But scribes ran everything. They collected taxes that funded the state. They maintained records that enabled governance. They documented history that justified power. This shaped society profoundly. The emphasis on record-keeping created the historical documentation we study today. The value placed on education enabled some social mobility for talented individuals. The administrative apparatus allowed a relatively small elite to control vast territories and populations efficiently. But scribes didn't just record transactions. They shaped culture, controlled narratives, and decided what would be remembered. Their greatest power was choosing what to write down and what to erase. And they used that power ruthlessly. Scribes didn't just record history. They rewrote it, erased inconvenient truths, and created the Egypt they wanted you to see. We found the receipts. When royal achievements occurred, scribes documented them in exhaustive detail. Military victories were recorded with troop counts, enemy casualties, and territory gained. Building projects were described with measurements, materials, and completion dates. Religious festivals received meticulous chronicling, but when ordinary people lived their lives, scraped by, struggled, and died, scribes noted them only incidentally. A worker appeared in records when receiving rations or filing complaints, not as a person worth documenting for their own sake. This wasn't neutral record-keeping. It was ideological construction. Scribes served state interests. They emphasized divine kingship, presenting pharaohs as gods walking among mortals. They celebrated cosmic order, the concept of mat that required everyone accepting their designated place. They documented eternal stability even during periods of chaos and change. The narrative served power. Sometimes the manipulation was dramatic and visible. When individuals fell from favor, their names were chiseled from monuments. This practice, called damnatio memoriae, wasn't random vandalism. It was official erasure. Scribes systematically removed someone from historical record, literally carving them out of existence. Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh who ruled successfully for decades, had her name and images removed from monuments after her death. Her successor wanted her reign forgotten. Unfavorable records were destroyed or altered. Alternative versions of events were created to serve current political needs. When new dynasties seized power, scribes rewrote the previous dynasty's achievements as failures, and their own rise as inevitable restoration of proper order. History was revised in real time to justify whoever currently held authority. The remarkable twist: some scribes documented their own manipulations. Marginalia in administrative texts reveal scribes noting discrepancies between official narratives and actual events. Alternative accounts survived in archives, preserved by scribes, aware they were constructing narrative rather than simply recording facts. They knew what they were doing. They understood their power to shape memory. Instructional texts for student scribes reveal the worldview explicitly. The satire of the trades, copied by generations of students, systematically mocked every profession except scribehood. Farmers were portrayed as dirty and stupid, craftsmen as crude and uncultured, soldiers as violent and doomed. Only scribes possessed wisdom, comfort, and status worth pursuing. This was propaganda, teaching future scribes to view themselves as superior and everyone else as beneath them. Other texts instructed students in pleasing superiors while protecting their own interests. Advice on navigating bureaucratic hierarchies, techniques for avoiding blame when things went wrong, methods for taking credit when things went right. The education wasn't just technical skills. It was indoctrination into a class that saw itself as fundamentally different from and better than everyone else. Yet here's the paradox. Scribes preserved an incredible amount of information. Administrative necessity required documenting mundane details. Tax records, ration distributions, legal proceedings, all the ordinary transactions of daily life survived because bureaucracy demanded record-keeping. This is why we know what we know about ancient Egypt. Scribes created and maintained archives that preserved 3,000 years of history. But they prioritized certain narratives over others. Royal achievements received elaborate documentation. Workers' lives appeared only in administrative contexts. Women were documented less than men. Children barely appeared at all. Entire categories of human experience were systematically underrepresented, not through deliberate destruction, but through selection of what deserved detailed recording. Specific cases reveal the pattern. The Amarna period, when Akhenaten attempted monotheistic revolution, was systematically erased after his death. His successors had his monuments destroyed, his name removed, his capital abandoned. We know about him only because erasure was incomplete. Queens who ruled as regents had their achievements attributed to male relatives or minimized in official records. Workers' strikes survived in documents only because administrative scribes needed to explain why ration deliveries failed. Modern historians depend entirely on scribal sources for understanding ancient Egypt. Every text, every inscription, every administrative record comes filtered through scribal perspective. Their biases became our limitations. Their priorities shaped what survived. Their political constraints determined what could be recorded. This requires critical reading. Modern historians must examine what's absent as carefully as what's present. Why don't more women appear in records? Not because women weren't important, but because scribes didn't prioritize documenting them. Why do workers appear primarily as problems in administrative texts? Not because they only caused problems, but because scribes noted them mainly when they disrupted smooth administration. Archaeology provides counter-narratives. Physical evidence sometimes contradicts textual records. Excavated workers' villages reveal living standards scribes didn't bother describing. Skeletal analysis shows health outcomes texts don't mention. Material culture speaks where scribes were silent. This documentary emphasizes material culture precisely to access Egyptian reality beyond scribal mediation. Houses, bones, artifacts, the physical remnants that survived, regardless of whether scribes deemed them worth recording. But one group had even more reason to control narratives than royal scribes: religious authorities. Priests shaped not just what people knew, but what they believed. and the religious reality of ordinary Egyptians was nothing like the temples suggest. Egyptian scribes could calculate the volume of pyramids and the rations for 10,000 workers, but the calculations they left behind reveal secrets about wealth and power that pharaohs wanted hidden. Egypt ran on numbers. Everything was calculated with precision that seems almost obsessive by modern standards. Land measurements for taxation required determining exact field areas after the Nile flood redrew boundaries annually. Grain calculations tracked harvests, storage, and distribution across the kingdom. Labor accounting managed tens of thousands of workers on public projects. Commodity exchanges established value equivalencies, allowing trade without standardized currency. Inheritance divisions split property among multiple heirs according to complex legal formulas. Scribes needed sophisticated mathematical knowledge, and the evidence shows they possessed it. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, copied around 1650 BCE from older sources, contained solutions to 84 problems. Fraction calculations, geometric area computations, practical engineering mathematics. The problems aren't theoretical exercises. They're real-world applications, calculating how much grain fills a cylindrical granary, determining pyramid slope ratios, surveying irregular land plots. Egyptian multiplication and division methods differed from modern techniques but worked effectively. They used doubling and halving, building complex calculations from simple operations. Unit fractions 1/2, 1/3, 1/4 formed the basis of their system. Converting other fractions into sums of unit fractions was cumbersome but functional. Geometric formulas for calculating areas and volumes were remarkably accurate enough to design and build monuments that still stand 4,000 years later. The mathematics was fundamentally practical. Egyptians didn't develop abstract number theory or explore mathematics for its own sake. They solved problems they actually faced. How to measure flooded fields, how to calculate grain storage capacity, how to determine fair inheritance divisions, how to coordinate labor and resources for massive construction projects. The mathematics served administration and engineering. This meant mathematical knowledge spread widely among scribes and administrative officials. Egypt required a numerate bureaucratic class capable of managing a complex economy. Student exercises surviving on limestone fragments show progression from simple addition to complex problem solving. Teachers corrected errors. Students practiced until calculations became automatic. Egyptian mathematics had clear limitations. They struggled with abstract concepts that didn't correspond to physical reality. They had no zero, no negative numbers, no algebraic notation. Their fraction system was awkward and limited, but within practical application, their mathematics was highly effective. Pyramids were built using geometric calculations so precise that modern surveyors are still impressed by the accuracy. Mathematical papyri reveal everyday calculations, tax computations showing how officials extracted revenue, wage distributions documenting payment hierarchies, measurement conversions enabling trade, even recreational mathematics with puzzles and games for entertainment. Here's where it gets interesting. These calculations, being purely functional, sometimes preserved truths that political texts concealed. Tax records reveal actual rates rather than official proclamations. Ration records show real quantities distributed, not idealized claims. Wage calculations document what different types of labor were actually valued, revealing hierarchies and inequalities. Computational archaeology uses these numbers to reconstruct realities. Workers' ration records specifying daily bread and beer quantities allow calculating caloric intake and nutritional adequacy. Tax records reveal wealth, concentration, and economic inequality. Wage calculations show that specialized craftsmen earned multiples of what common laborers received, documenting class stratification through pure numbers. The numbers don't lie the way narratives can. A scribe might write flowery prose about Pharaoh's generosity, but ration calculations show exactly how much workers actually received. Official texts might proclaim prosperity, but tax records reveal extraction rates that impoverished farmers. Mathematics was power. Scribes who could calculate controlled resources. They determined who owed what taxes. They tracked who received what rations. They managed inventories and supervised distributions. Mathematical literacy created opportunities for advancement that manual skills never could. These administrative records, preserved because they were too mundane to destroy, reveal more truth about Egyptian society than royal propaganda ever intended. But all this administration, the scribes, the mathematics, the record-keeping, served one fundamental purpose: extracting resources from the land. Egypt's power came from one source: agriculture. And the farmers who made it all possible were the most forgotten people of all. Egyptian farmers fed 3 continents. In return, the state took most of what they grew, conscripted them for construction, and erased them from history. The Nile governed everything. Egypt's entire civilization rose and fell with the river's annual rhythm. In Akhet, the inundation season, floodwaters spread across the valley, covering fields with water that carried rich silt from the Ethiopian highlands. This wasn't gentle irrigation, it was transformation. The landscape disappeared under brown water for months. Farmers waited, watching water levels, praying the flood reached the right height. Too low meant famine. Fields wouldn't receive enough water or silt. Crops would fail. People would starve. Too high meant destruction. Villages flooded. Homes collapsed. Livestock drowned. The flood had to be just right, and farmers had no control over it beyond prayer and observation. When waters receded in Peret, the growing season, farmers moved immediately. Timing was everything. Mud still wet from the flood had to be ploughed before it dried hard. Farmers guided wooden ploughs pulled by oxen across fields, breaking earth and mixing deposited silt. They sowed seed by hand, walking in rows, broadcasting grain in practiced arcs. Emmer wheat and barley primarily, the grains that became bread and beer. Flax for linen, vegetables in smaller plots. Then came the endless labour of maintenance. Irrigation channels had to be cleared and repaired. Water had to be lifted from canals to fields using shaduf, lever, and bucket systems, requiring constant physical effort. Later innovations like the sarkié, animal-powered water wheels, eased some burden, but most irrigation remained manual. Weeding was constant. Birds and animals threatened crops, requiring watching and scaring. Disease and pests could destroy harvests despite all precautions. Shemu, harvest season, brought brutal work in brutal heat. Farmers cut grain with sickles, bending and straightening thousands of times daily. Grain had to be gathered, threshed, winnowed, and stored before spoilage. And before farmers could keep any for themselves, tax collectors arrived. The state's share came first. Temple estates took their portion. Landlords extracted rent. What remained was subsistence. Most Egyptians were farmers. Most farmers didn't own the land they worked. Temple estates controlled vast agricultural holdings. Royal estates owned more. Private landlords possessed large tracts. Farmers worked as tenants under arrangements that varied from oppressive to relatively fair depending on who owned the land and which period of Egyptian history. But the fundamental relationship remained extraction. Farmers produced, others consumed what farmers produced. What they grew sustained not just Egypt but trading partners across the Mediterranean. Egyptian grain fed Greek cities, supplied Roman armies, sustained populations far beyond the Nile Valley. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world because agricultural productivity was extraordinarily high. The Nile's annual flood provided natural irrigation and fertilization without requiring the elaborate irrigation infrastructure needed in Mesopotamia. Egypt's climate allowed long growing seasons, sometimes multiple harvests annually in favorable conditions, and Egyptian farmers had developed sophisticated techniques refined across millennia. Evidence suggests crop rotation practices that maintained soil fertility. Selective breeding produced grain varieties adapted to local conditions. Farmers understood soil quality indicators and adjusted planting accordingly. Irrigation engineering became increasingly sophisticated over centuries. But this productivity came at human cost. Farmers worked from sunrise to sunset during planting and harvest seasons. Their labor was backbreaking and relentless. Most surplus was extracted, leaving farmers at subsistence levels despite producing abundance. During Akhet, when floods covered fields and agricultural work stopped, farmers faced another demand. Corvée labor conscripted them for public works, pyramid building, temple construction, canal maintenance. This wasn't voluntary service. It was taxation paid in labor rather than goods. Farmers couldn't refuse without facing punishment. The monuments of Egypt were built on agricultural surplus and forced labor during agricultural downtime. Without farmers' production, nothing else Egyptian could have existed. No scribes without grain to pay them. No pyramids without surplus to feed builders. No art, no bureaucracy, no temples, no philosophy. Everything rested on farmers' labor, extracting nutrients from Nile-deposited silt and converting them into food that sustained civilization. But farmers weren't passive victims. They resisted, negotiated, and sometimes rebelled against exploitation. The evidence of their resistance was deliberately hidden because it threatened state legitimacy. Farmers hid grain from tax collectors, fled to escape conscription, and occasionally murdered officials. State records documented it all, then historians ignored it for centuries. Administrative correspondence reveals a reality official narratives never acknowledged. Letters between officials complain endlessly about farmers who don't deliver required amounts. The farmers of this district have hidden their grain, one Middle Kingdom text records. They claim the harvest was poor, but our inspectors report otherwise. Another document describes farmers concealing livestock in remote locations before tax assessors arrived. This wasn't occasional crime. It was systematic resistance embedded in the agricultural economy. Tax evasion took multiple forms: underreporting harvests, claiming crop failures that didn't occur, bribing local officials to reduce assessments, moving grain to relatives in other districts before collection. The administrative apparatus spent enormous energy trying to prevent farmers from keeping what they grew. When evasion failed, some farmers fled. New Kingdom records describe entire villages abandoned, fields left unworked because residents escaped to avoid taxation or conscription. This created chronic labor shortages that destabilized regional economies. Officials sent search parties. They offered incentives for farmers to return. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't. Work slowdowns appear in records of missed quotas and administrative frustration. Farmers working just slowly enough to avoid punishment, but not fast enough to meet targets. Deliberate inefficiency as resistance. Officials couldn't prove intentional sabotage, but they documented suspicions in letters requesting authority to discipline uncooperative farmers. Violence occurred more often than official narratives suggest. Middle Kingdom texts describe farmers beaten for tax arrears. The beatings were systematic, documented in administrative procedure. New Kingdom records mention punitive expeditions sent to collect taxes forcibly, suggesting resistance violent enough to require military response. Ptolemaic period documents show armed tax collectors, evidence that the system expected physical confrontation. Occasionally, farmers killed officials. These cases appear in legal records as crimes requiring investigation and punishment. But their presence in archives proves that exploitation sometimes pushed people beyond endurance into direct violence. Most resistance was subtler than murder. Farmers offered poor quality grain as tax payment, keeping better grain for themselves. They complied minimally, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. They exploited administrative inefficiency, taking advantage of gaps in oversight to reduce their burden marginally. Some farmers negotiated. Petitions survive asking for tax reduction after genuine crop failures. Some were granted, suggesting the system had mechanisms for adjustment when circumstances warranted. Requests for seed grain and tools indicate some reciprocity in landlord-tenant relationships. Not generosity, but recognition that starving farmers couldn't produce next season's harvest. The state responded to resistance through multiple strategies: Ideologically, emphasis on Ma'at, cosmic order, requiring everyone to accept their designated place. Religious teaching promising afterlife rewards for compliance and punishment for rebellion. Practically, administrative reforms when resistance became destabilizing enough to threaten revenue collection. Periodic famines revealed the system's fragility. When Nile floods failed and harvests collapsed, social control broke down. Evidence shows banditry, administrative collapse, regional fragmentation. The state's power depended on agricultural surplus. Without it, authority evaporated. These crises proved that farmer compliance was negotiated, not automatic. Farmers worked because the alternative was worse, not because they accepted the system's legitimacy. All this evidence survived in administrative sources. Officials documented problems because they needed to explain failures and request resources to address resistance. But official narratives portrayed contented subjects working cheerfully under benevolent authority. The disconnect between administrative reality and propaganda was complete. Historians studying Egypt focused on propaganda, not administrative complaints. Resistance was treated as anomalous rather than systemic. The narrative of stable, harmonious Egypt persisted despite evidence showing constant conflict between farmers and extractive authority. But not everyone could resist through hiding grain or fleeing. For the most vulnerable Egyptians, children's survival itself was uncertain. And what happened to children reveals truths about Egyptian society that no propaganda could hide. Egyptian farmers created the surplus that built the pyramids. In return, history forgot their names, their faces, and everything they sacrificed. We're trying to remember they were the foundation of everything. Every scribe's salary came from grain farmers grew. Every pyramid block was moved by labor freed because farmers produced surplus. Every temple, every statue, every piece of art that makes Egypt magnificent in our imagination was funded by agricultural production. Yet farmers themselves disappeared from historical record almost completely. The erasure has multiple causes. Farmers left few texts because most couldn't read or write. Their homes were mud brick, eroding back into earth within generations while stone temples and tombs endured millennia. Their lives weren't considered historically significant by the scribes who decided what to document. Their labor was taken for granted, invisible infrastructure supporting visible achievements. The injustice is profound. Farmers created everything and received no recognition. They worked until their bodies broke, producing abundance consumed by others, and history recorded them only as problems when they resisted or statistics when officials counted them for taxation. 2 March shows agricultural scenes. Farmers harvesting grain, herders driving cattle, workers tending fields under supervision. The images are beautifully rendered, detailed and idealized. But they don't honor farmers. They glorify tomb owners, demonstrating the deceased's wealth and power. Farmers appear as anonymous background figures, interchangeable decorative elements. Their individuality is erased in service of elite self-celebration. What little we know comes from fragments. Farmers lived in small villages, simple homes with minimal possessions. They worked dawn to dusk through planting and harvest seasons. Their existence was subsistence level despite producing abundance. Archaeological evidence from rural sites reveals harsh realities. Skeletal analysis shows malnutrition. Farmers were shorter on average than workers at pyramid sites, indicating worse nutrition during growth years. Disease rates were higher. Despite feeding everyone else, farmers often went hungry themselves. The system extracted so much surplus that producers themselves suffered deprivation. Occupational stress appears clearly in bones. Spines deformed from carrying heavy loads and bending constantly during planting and harvest. Joints worn from repetitive movements performed thousands of times daily across decades. Early mortality compared to populations with less physically demanding lives. The major revelation comes from genetic and skeletal analysis. Ancient Egyptian farmers are direct ancestors of modern Egyptian farmers. Population continuity over thousands of years. The same families working the same land along the Nile Valley. millennia of agricultural labor connecting ancient past to present, yet historically invisible across that entire span. Egypt's glamorous civilization rested on systematic exploitation of agricultural labor. That exploitation was ideologically naturalized through religious teaching about cosmic order, requiring everyone to accept their place. It was erased through historical documentation that focused on elites, while treating farmers as interchangeable labor units unworthy of individual recognition. Rare exceptions exist. A handful of farmer-soldier biographies from men who achieved military advancement. Legal documents where farmers appear as litigants asserting rights. Occasional tomb inscriptions from farmers who accumulated enough success to afford burial markers. These fragments reveal personalities, ambitions, dignity. They make the systematic erasure more poignant because they show what was lost individual human lives with stories worth telling. Modern archaeology attempts recovery. Recent excavations focus on rural sites and farmer remains. Analysis of skeletal evidence, settlement patterns, agricultural technology. But this work is recent and underfunded compared to study of elite sites. Pyramids and temples still attract most resources and attention. The pattern reveals whose lives historians value, whose stories get told and whose get erased. These aren't neutral scholarly choices. They reflect what societies consider significant. Ancient Egypt valued kings, priests, scribes. Farmers were necessary, but not notable. Modern Egyptology replicated these values for centuries, only recently questioning whose history deserves recovery. But if farmers were invisible to history, children were even more so. Ancient Egypt had no special sentiment about childhood. Children were economic assets or losses, valued for future labor or mourned for wasted investment. The reality of childhood in ancient Egypt will disturb you. 1 in 2 Egyptian children died before age 5. Parents mourned them, buried them with toys, and then expected the next child to survive. How did anyone endure that? Skeletal evidence from cemetery excavations tells a story official histories never recorded. Approximately half of all children born in ancient Egypt didn't live to see their 5th birthday. The numbers are staggering and consistent across multiple burial sites. Small bones outnumber adult remains in common cemeteries. Tiny graves cluster together, in sections devoted to those who barely began living. Every child who died was mourned. Every loss represented grief that transcends time. Parents who buried their children 3,000 years ago felt the same devastation parents feel now. But the societal implications were different. This mortality rate wasn't exceptional or tragic in the way modern societies would consider it. It was normal, expected, factored into economic planning and family strategies. The causes were brutally consistent. Infectious diseases, especially diarrheal illnesses from contaminated water. The Nile provided life but also carried parasites and bacteria. Children's developing immune systems couldn't fight what adults might survive. Malnutrition weakened resistance. In subsistence households, children often ate last and least. When food was scarce, adults needed strength for labor. Children suffered the deficit. Accidents claimed others, drownings in irrigation canals and the Nile itself. Falls from rooftops where children played, burns from cooking fires and oil lamps. The environment held constant dangers for small bodies and developing coordination. Childbirth killed mothers and doomed newborns. Maternal death often meant infant death in a society without formula or wet nurses readily available to poor families. Difficult births killed both mother and child despite medical knowledge that could handle some complications. Cemetery excavations reveal how families responded. Child burials show care and attention. Small bodies wrapped in linen, positioned carefully, accompanied by objects meant to comfort or protect. Grave goods include amulets designed to ward off harm in the afterlife. Tiny toys, wooden dolls, leather balls, clay animal figures, suggesting hope that children would play in paradise. Class differences appear starkly in survival rates. Elite children had better odds, superior nutrition during pregnancy and infancy, access to physicians and medical care, safer living environments with fewer hazards. But even elite families lost children regularly. Wealth improved chances but couldn't eliminate risk. Families developed emotional resilience as defense against constant loss, not callousness, but calibration. Loving children while knowing many wouldn't survive required psychological adaptations we can barely imagine. Religious beliefs provided framework. Children who died could still reach the afterlife. Paradise awaited them. This wasn't empty comfort, but genuine conviction that death wasn't final separation. High fertility rates compensated for high mortality. Women who survived childbirth themselves often bore 8 or 10 children, expecting half might reach adulthood. This wasn't choice in the modern sense, but adaptation to demographic reality. Despite mortality, evidence shows Egyptians loved their children deeply. Letters express devastation at children's deaths. One father writes that his heart is empty after losing his son. A mother's inscription describes her daughter as the one who made my heart live, and mourns that she's gone. These aren't formulaic phrases, but genuine expressions of grief. Medical papyri include pediatric treatments, prescriptions for children's fevers, digestive problems, respiratory illnesses. Magical spells sought to protect children from disease and danger. Parents tried everything available to save sick children. The effort itself demonstrates value placed on children's lives. Children were seen as sources of joy, obligations for parents, hope for family continuation. Instructional texts describe children as bringing happiness to households, but they were also expected to contribute economically from young ages. The distinction between childhood and adulthood blurred. Children who survived infancy became workers quickly. High mortality created a society where death was omnipresent. Grief was constant background noise. Every family knew loss intimately. Emotional attachment had to coexist with probable loss. This doesn't mean Egyptians didn't love their children. It means their experience of parenthood differed fundamentally from modern patterns where child survival is expected rather than hoped for. Children rarely appear in historical records because they hadn't achieved social roles worth documenting. Their deaths weren't historically significant. Only children who survived to become notable adults merited recording. But the children who survived faced their own challenges: exploitation, early labor, and education that determined their entire future. What childhood actually looked like in ancient Egypt contradicts everything modern people assume. Egyptian children started working at age 5. By age 10, many were skilled laborers. The lucky ones were in school learning to be scribes. The rest? History forgot them twice, once as children, once as workers. Childhood as a protected period of play and learning didn't exist for most ancient Egyptians. Children became economic participants as soon as their small hands could perform useful tasks. Around age 5 or 6, children began contributing to family survival. In agricultural settings, young children scared birds from fields, pulled weeds, and helped with harvest. Their small size was sometimes advantageous. They could move through crops without damaging plants, reach into tight spaces, and perform repetitive tasks adults found tedious. Workshop labor absorbed other children. Pottery workshops, textile production, carpentry, all employed children for sorting materials, running errands, cleaning workspaces, and gradually learning trades. A potter's child would begin by preparing clay, progress to simple forms, eventually master the wheel. Learning happened through doing, not formal instruction. Household work consumed significant child labor. Fetching water from wells or the Nile, grinding grain for bread, tending younger siblings, sweeping, washing. These tasks were essential and time-consuming. Children's contributions freed adults for work that required greater strength or skill. Tomb art depicts children working. Boys herding goats, girls helping with flax harvests, children carrying materials. The images are idealized, showing orderly and apparently content child workers. But they reflect real practices. Children worked because families needed their labor. Textual evidence appears sporadically. Legal documents occasionally mention child workers. Apprenticeship contracts sometimes begin at ages that seem shockingly young by modern standards. Ration records show children receiving smaller portions, indicating their presence in work settings, but acknowledging their lesser consumption needs and productivity. The educational system created stark divisions. Elite children and children of specialized workers entered schools around age 9. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and profession-specific knowledge. A scribe's son attended school and likely became a scribe. The education wasn't just technical training but social reproduction, maintaining class structures across generations. Most children received no formal education. Farmer children learned farming by farming alongside parents. A craftsman's son apprenticed in his father's trade, learning through observation and practice. The stratification was nearly deterministic. Birth largely determined future. Social mobility existed but remained exceptional. Some children did achieve remarkable advancement. Records show several viziers began as sons of minor officials who received education, enabling upward movement. Worker children occasionally became scribes through literacy training, escaping manual labor entirely. These success stories prove the system allowed some fluidity, though the rarity of such cases proves how constrained opportunities were. Archaeological evidence reveals child labor's physical traces. Small tools found in workshops were sized for child hands. Skeletal analysis shows occupational stress markers in juvenile remains bone development affected by repetitive movements and heavy loads. Children's burials near work sites suggest they lived where they labored. Some children had limited agency within the system. Legal documents show children making contracts with parental consent. Some received property. Some chose professions different from parents, though this required resources and opportunities most lacked. The dark reality. Extreme poverty sometimes forced families to sell children into servitude. Evidence suggests this happened, though relatively rarely. The practice differed from chattel slavery. Children weren't property in the permanent sense, but it meant children worked in other households, separated from families, with uncertain futures. By ancient standards, child labor wasn't cruelty. It was economic necessity. Pre-industrial families needed every member's contribution. Children's work was normalized, even valorized as proper preparation for adult responsibilities. The concept that childhood should be primarily about play and education is modern and depends on economic surplus that ancient families didn't have. But not all children worked in fields or workshops. Some children were trained for the most important profession in Egypt, priesthood. And what happened in temples, especially to children, reveals secrets about Egyptian religion that will fundamentally change your understanding. A child buried 3,500 years ago clutched a wooden doll in their arms. Somebody made that doll with care. Somebody mourned that child. Their name is lost, but their story isn't. Despite work obligations and mortality rates that seem unbearable, Egyptian children still played. Archaeological evidence reveals toys that show both ingenuity and affection. Wooden dolls with movable limbs, hair made from mud beads threaded and attached. The craftsmanship indicates someone spent time creating objects specifically for children's enjoyment. Leather balls stuffed with reeds or fabric scraps, sewn carefully to withstand rough play. Toy animals carved from wood or molded from clay horses, hippos, crocodiles, spinning tops. Pull toys with wheels that actually turned. The variety and quality of some toys suggest children's play was valued. Families invested scarce resources in objects that served no practical purpose except bringing joy. Even poor families made simple toys from available materials. Wealthier families commissioned elaborate playthings. But across social classes, children had toys. Games extended beyond individual play. Children played Senet, the board game adults enjoyed. Two March shows children engaged in tug-of-war. Leapfrog, various ball games. These depictions are idealized, but they reflect real activities. Games taught cooperation and competition. Physical games developed coordination and strength. Play was socialization, preparing children for adult social roles while allowing them to be children. Tomb art depicting children playing suggests that childhood play was considered normal and worthy of representation. The scenes show children wrestling, dancing, playing with toys. The very fact that artists included these moments indicates they were valued parts of life worth commemorating. Festivals provided special opportunities for children. Evidence suggests children participated in religious processions, received special foods during celebrations, joined community gatherings. These occasions broke routine, offered treats and entertainment, created memories that children carried into adulthood if they survived. Surviving texts written by or for children are rare but revealing. School exercises show children's errors and teachers' corrections, humanizing ancient students struggling with homework, just like modern children. Letters from children to parents express affection and mundane concerns, asking for treats, reporting on daily activities, missing family members. Children's names preserved in documents prove they were individuals with identities, not just anonymous young people. Burial evidence provides the most moving testimony. Analysis reveals that some children were buried with extraordinary care even when families had little. A worker's child buried with a favorite toy clutched in small hands. A farmer's child wrapped in carefully prepared linen shroud despite the family's poverty. Elite children buried with miniature furniture and implements for the afterlife. Tiny beds, small storage jars, child-sized tools. These burials show personalization. Families didn't perform generic rituals. They mourned specific children with specific preferences and personalities. The toy buried with a child was that child's toy, worn from play. The placement of small bodies showed tenderness. Parents positioned children carefully, as if tucking them into sleep. Medical texts address children's emotional needs, treating fears and anxieties as legitimate concerns. Magical spells protected children from nightmares, suggesting awareness that children's psychological well-being mattered. Tomb inscriptions from parents express profound love. One describes a child as the light of my days. Another mourns the one whose laughter filled our home. The paradox is inescapable. Children were economic assets whose labor contributed to family survival. They were mortality statistics, half dying before age 5. But they were also beloved individuals whose loss devastated parents and whose joy brought meaning to family life. These realities coexisted in ways that seem contradictory but reflected complex ancient humanity. Reconstructing children's experiences is challenging. Children rarely left direct testimony. But archaeology allows fragmentary recovery. Toys tell us children played. Burials show they were mourned. Skeletal evidence reveals their struggles. Incidental mentions in texts prove they existed as individuals. From fragments, we reconstruct lives that were often brief and hard, but also contained play, love, and meaning. Children who survived became adults who faced another reality: the state's power to compel their labor, their loyalty, and their lives. And when Egyptians had enough, when the system failed too spectacularly, they did something no one expected. They rebelled. When Egyptian workers struck in 1152 BCE, they weren't just demanding food. They were proving that even pharaohs needed workers, more than workers needed pharaohs. And they won. Year 29 of Ramesses III's reign. The workers at Deir el-Medina hadn't received their rations in weeks. Administrative corruption and resource depletion had broken the system. Grain sat in warehouses while workers went hungry. Oil and other provisions were diverted or simply never arrived. The workers who carved and painted royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings had nothing to eat. They could have rioted. They could have vandalized the tombs they were building. They could have scattered to their home villages and never returned. Instead, they organized. Representatives were chosen from different crafts. Stone carvers, painters, plasterers, each group selecting someone to speak for collective interests. They formulated demands carefully, not just give us food, but specific quantities owed, back pay calculated precisely, and accountability for officials who had failed in their duties. Then they marched, not to the tombs where they worked, where a strike would be invisible, not to their own village, where they could be ignored. They marched to the temples and administrative centers where officials worked, where disruption would be public and impossible to dismiss. They sat down. They refused to move. They refused to work. The sophistication of their action reveals political consciousness that historians claimed ancient workers couldn't possess. They understood leverage. Their specialized skills made them irreplaceable. You couldn't train new workers to paint tomb walls with the required precision in weeks or months. The state needed them more than they individually needed any particular employer. They organized across craft divisions. Stone carvers and painters had different skills and potentially competing interests, but they acted together. Class solidarity superseded craft rivalry. This wasn't spontaneous combustion. This was conscious organizing. They framed demands in terms of justice, invoking marked cosmic order that required everyone, including pharaohs, to fulfill obligations. This wasn't begging. This was demanding what they were owed according to principles the state itself claimed to uphold. The records preserved by scribe Amenakte reveal this wasn't a single incident. Workers struck multiple times over several months. When rations arrived late again, they stopped work again. When promises were broken, they returned to administrative buildings. This was sustained labor organizing, a breakdown of state worker relations that threatened the entire system. Officials initially dismissed them. Threats were made, but workers remained unified. When threats failed, negotiation began. Administrators consulted with higher officials. Messages were sent. Eventually, concessions came. Back pay was guaranteed. Corrupt officials faced discipline. Workers returned to their jobs having won partially, not completely, but meaningfully. This proves something crucial. Even in autocratic ancient states, power was negotiated rather than absolute. The pharaoh was supposedly a god, but gods still needed workers to carve their tombs. And workers who understood that could extract concessions through collective action. The historical significance extends beyond this specific strike. It demonstrates that ordinary people could organize collective action 3,000 years ago. Labor organizing isn't a modern invention born from industrial capitalism. It's a fundamental human response to exploitation that appears whenever workers gain consciousness of their collective power. The strikes contributed to broader instability during the late New Kingdom. Centralized authority weakened. Workers gained more autonomy. The system never fully recovered. Whether the strikes caused or merely reflected that decline remains debated, but they were part of systemic breakdown. The event was buried but not suppressed. The scribe who documented it was recording administrative problems, explaining why work stopped and rations needed to be provided. He wasn't creating historical narrative or celebrating worker power. Later, historians ignored these administrative records because labor history wasn't considered significant. Workers weren't viewed as historical agents capable of shaping events. The implications are profound. If workers struck successfully in 1152 BCE, how many other instances of resistance occurred but went unrecorded? How much negotiation between workers and power has been lost because chroniclers didn't consider it worth documenting? Labor organizing appears in other ancient societies. Roman workers struck, Chinese workers organized, Mesopotamian workers negotiated collectively. Workers everywhere have always contested power, even when historical narrative erases that contestation. But strikes weren't the only form of resistance. When centralized power collapsed, as it did several times in Egyptian history, something remarkable happened. Ordinary people seized control of their own lives, and the evidence of what they built is still being uncovered. Egyptian historians called it the First Intermediate Period, a time of chaos and darkness. Recent archaeology calls it something else, a time when ordinary people could finally breathe. Around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed. Centralized authority that had controlled Egypt for centuries fragmented. Regional governors, the nomarchs, became independent rulers. The Pyramid Age ended, Traditional Egyptology treated this as catastrophic decline, a fall from ordered civilization into disorder. But the evidence tells a different story. During the first intermediate period, non-elite people commissioned tombs and monuments previously restricted to elites. Burial practices show individuals who would never have afforded stone tombs under centralized control suddenly memorializing themselves in permanent form. This suggests wealth redistribution. When central authority collapsed, resources weren't funneling exclusively upward. Some stayed local. Social hierarchy became more fluid. Regional variation in artistic styles indicates freedom from centralized aesthetic control. Texts from this period contain ideological challenges to divine kingship that would have been unthinkable during the Old Kingdom. People questioned the very premises of pharaonic authority. The term chaos is loaded. It reflects elite perspective. For those who benefited from centralized hierarchy, its collapse was disaster. But for ordinary people who had been exploited by that hierarchy, decentralization might have meant liberation. More autonomy, less extraction, opportunity to keep what they produced. The second intermediate period, beginning around 1650 BCE, complicates narratives further. The Hyksos, a foreign dynasty, ruled northern Egypt, while Theban rulers controlled the south. Traditional histories portrayed this as national humiliation, but evidence reveals technological and cultural flourishing. The Hyksos introduced horses and chariots to Egypt, revolutionizing transportation and warfare. They brought improved bronze-working techniques. Trade networks expanded. Cultural exchange accelerated between Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. Innovation occurred precisely during the period traditional histories characterized as decline. Eventually, Theban rulers reunified Egypt and expelled the Hyksos, portrayed in official narratives as restoration of proper order. But the period of division had brought advances that unified Egypt then adopted and claimed as its own. The third intermediate period saw Egypt fragment again around 1069 BCE. Multiple competing power centers emerged. No single pharaoh controlled the entire kingdom. By traditional metrics, this was collapse. But regional economies prospered in some areas. Architecture remained sophisticated. Cultural production continued. Here's what changes everything. Evidence suggests that during intermediate periods, women held more power. Several ruling queens and queen regents appear in records from these times. Without centralized patriarchal authority enforcing rigid gender hierarchies, women found opportunities to exercise political power that would have been impossible during unified kingdoms. Regional cults gained prominence over state religion. Local gods received devotion and resources previously monopolized by state temples. Religious diversity flourished when central authority couldn't enforce orthodoxy. Social mobility increased. With multiple competing power centers, talented individuals could move between courts, offering services to whoever valued them most. The rigid stratification of unified kingdoms loosened when competition for skilled personnel created opportunity. Why were these periods characterized as Dark Ages? Partly because they didn't produce massive pyramids or unified monuments that impressed early Egyptologists seeking spectacular finds. The architecture was regional and smaller scale, less dramatic but no less sophisticated. Historical sources from intermediate periods emphasized instability because they were written by elites for whom fragmentation meant loss of power and status. Their perspective dominated historical record. European scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries valorized centralized states. They saw strong central authority as necessary for civilization and viewed fragmentation as regression toward barbarism. This ideological bias shaped how they interpreted Egyptian intermediate periods. Counter-evidence shows continued sophistication. Regional architecture demonstrates engineering knowledge and aesthetic achievement. Texts reveal ongoing literacy and intellectual activity. Economic indicators suggest trade and production continued, sometimes increasing when freed from centralized control and extraction. The ideological function of forgetting these periods becomes clear. By portraying centralized control as necessary for prosperity and decentralization as chaos, Egyptian ideology justified hierarchical power structures. Kings needed subjects to believe that strong pharaonic authority was the only alternative to disaster. Later, Egyptology replicated this ideology, treating unified kingdoms as the real Egypt and intermediate periods as unfortunate interruptions. Only recently have archaeologists begun examining these periods on their own terms, rather than as failures to maintain centralization. What intermediate periods reveal is what Egyptian society looked like when ordinary people had more agency, when resources weren't extracted upward as efficiently, when social hierarchies were negotiable rather than fixed, when alternative power structures emerged. Elite powers had every reason to ensure these periods were remembered as cautionary disasters rather than as alternative possibilities. But eventually, centralized power always returned, and when it did, those who had tasted freedom remembered. Evidence of ongoing resistance, small-scale, local, persistent, appears throughout Egyptian history. We're only now learning to see it. Workers carved insults into the very monuments they built to glorify pharaohs. The curses they left behind reveal rage that official history never mentioned. They resisted in every way they could and left the evidence where no one thought to look. Graffiti covers Egyptian monuments, not just modern tourist vandalism, but ancient marks carved by the people who built and maintained these structures. Workers carved their names everywhere. Amenemhat was here, appears on temple walls, inside pyramids, on cliff faces near quarries. Simple self-assertion, claiming presence in spaces designed to erase individual identity. But other graffiti goes further. Insults against supervisors, crude drawings mocking authority figures with exaggerated features and ridiculous proportions. Complaints about working conditions scratched into stone where they would survive millennia. This was resistance through visibility. Workers claimed space on monuments meant to glorify rulers, asserting their own perspective literally on top of official narrative. Cursed tablets reveal rage that couldn't be expressed openly. Thin sheets of lead or broken pottery, inscribed with curses against enemies, then buried in sacred spaces or deposited where gods might hear them. Workers cursed supervisors who cheated them. Business rivals cursed each other. Occasionally, curses targeted officials or even royalty. The curses are specific and vicious. May his bones rot. May his children suffer. May the gods strike him down. People who couldn't challenge authority openly used magical means to express fury and seek cosmic justice. The tablets show social tensions, official records never acknowledged. Satirical texts channeled frustration through humor and coded criticism. Some surviving texts contain biting critiques of incompetent officials, lazy priests, corrupt administrators. The satire was often attributed to fictional characters or set in mythical times, providing cover, but the targets were recognizable. The criticisms were real. The major revelation comes from close examination of monuments themselves. Some workers deliberately sabotaged what they built, tiny mistakes in hieroglyphics that changed meanings from praise to insult. These errors look like carelessness to supervisors who couldn't read well, but they're perfectly calculated. A single wrong symbol transforms beloved of the gods into something mocking or obscene. Royal statues sometimes have slightly altered proportions, subtle distortions that make pharaohs look ridiculous to anyone who knows proper conventions. The changes are small enough to escape notice during construction, but permanent enough to endure. Workers built contempt into the very monuments celebrating power they resented. Hidden images appear in places supervisors wouldn't look. Inside sealed chambers, on surfaces that would be covered, in corners no one important would examine. Drawings mocking royalty. Symbols of resistance. Evidence that workers expressed dissent while appearing compliant. Religious resistance took more subtle forms. Ordinary people ignored official teachings when convenient. They maintained local cults despite official disapproval. They reinterpreted theology in ways that challenged hierarchy. Personal religious texts, show individuals appealing directly to gods rather than through priestly intermediaries. This was resistance to religious gatekeeping, claiming direct access to divine power. At Deir el-Medina, workers maintained a local oracle that decided community disputes. This created alternative authority to state justice. The oracle sometimes ruled against state officials, and workers enforced those rulings within their community. They created spaces of autonomy within constrained circumstances. Finding this resistance requires reading sources against the grain, looking for what's hidden or inadvertently preserved. Administrative complaints about non-compliance reveal that workers didn't comply. Gaps in official records suggest what authorities didn't want documented. Artifacts never meant to survive sometimes did, carrying evidence of dissent. Absence of documented rebellion doesn't mean absence of resistance. Most resistance was everyday, small-scale, persistent, non-compliance, subtle sabotage, coded criticism, maintaining alternative values. This hidden resistance shows that Egyptian social order required constant maintenance. Ordinary people constantly tested boundaries of control. But all this resistance, all this hidden defiance, what did it achieve? Did anything actually change? To answer that, we need to understand what happened to Egypt itself, because the civilization that built pyramids eventually fell, and what replaced it tells us everything about what they tried to erase. Egyptians welcomed Alexander the Great as a liberator. Within 3 centuries, their entire civilization would be erased not by force, but by cultural transformation so complete that even their gods would be forgotten. When Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he wasn't resisted, he was celebrated. The Persian occupation that preceded him had been brutal. The Persian-supported Egyptian dynasties had been extractive and oppressive. Alexander represented liberation from immediate oppression, even if he represented a different form of foreign control. The paradox cuts deep. Foreign conquest as liberation, but from the perspective of ordinary Egyptians suffering under Persian tribute, demands, and administrative corruption, Greek rule initially offered relief. The Ptolemaic period that followed brought administrative reforms. Tax burdens decreased in some regions. New economic opportunities emerged as Egypt integrated into Mediterranean trade networks. The Ptolemies needed Egyptian cooperation to govern effectively. They couldn't simply impose foreign rule on a population that vastly outnumbered them, so they made concessions to local elites and priests. Cultural synthesis followed. Greek and Egyptian cultures mixed, creating hybrid forms visible in art, religion, and language. Many Egyptians learned Greek. They adopted Greek names alongside Egyptian ones, navigating between cultures strategically. Greek-style civic institutions emerged in cities, and some Egyptians participated, gaining access to new forms of political and economic power. For Egyptian priests, Ptolemaic rule brought opportunities. The Greek rulers patronized traditional temples, funding construction and ritual. Priests maintained religious authority and gained royal support. Egyptian soldiers served in Ptolemaic armies, receiving land grants that provided economic security. Egyptian merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean, accessing markets previously closed. But Greeks held top administrative positions. Taxation remained heavy, just collected by different authorities. Egyptian culture was increasingly subordinated to Greek models. The language of power was Greek. The aesthetic standards were Greek. Egypt was becoming culturally Greek while remaining geographically Egyptian. Roman conquest in 30 BCE accelerated the transformation. After Cleopatra VII's defeat, Egypt became Rome's personal possession, not even granted provincial status. The emperor owned Egypt outright. What this meant was brutal efficiency and extraction. Egypt became Rome's granary. Massive grain shipments fed the empire. Taxation increased to levels that would have sparked rebellion under earlier administrations, but Roman military presence made resistance suicidal. Native Egyptian culture was further marginalized. The hieroglyphic tradition was dying. Traditional priesthoods declined as state support shifted. Yet, paradoxically, some aspects of life improved. Roman roads and infrastructure enhanced trade and communication. Roman law provided legal frameworks that, while serving imperial interests, offered some protections ordinary Egyptians could use. The Pax Romana reduced constant warfare that had plagued earlier periods. Foreign occupation brought exploitation but also stability and connectivity. Egyptians adapted. Some Greeks and Romans who settled in Egypt adopted Egyptian religion. Isis worship spread throughout the Roman Empire, carried by soldiers and merchants. Egyptian workers found employment in Roman building projects. Egyptian culture persisted in modified, hybridized forms. But the transformation was relentless. Over centuries, distinctively Egyptian civilization eroded. Hieroglyphic writing disappeared. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE. After that, no one could read the language that had expressed Egyptian thought for 3,000 years. Traditional religion declined as Christianity spread. Egypt became culturally Mediterranean rather than distinctively Egyptian. Resistance occurred. Occasional revolts were brutally suppressed. Some communities maintained Egyptian religion and language longer than others, practicing cultural resistance through preservation. Syncretism allowed Egyptians to blend their traditions with foreign elements, preserving core identity in hybrid form. But Christianity's arrival in the 1st century CE began the final transformation. By the 4th century, Egypt was Christian, Greek-speaking, and culturally Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian civilization had been conquered, not just politically but culturally. The gods were forgotten, the language was dead. The civilization that had endured 3,000 years vanished within 4 centuries of foreign rule. But something survived. Even as temples closed and hieroglyphs became unintelligible, fragments of ancient Egyptian knowledge, belief, and practice persisted underground. And when those fragments were rediscovered over 1,000 years later, they would launch obsessions that continue to this day. The last person who could read hieroglyphs died around 400 CE. For 14 centuries, ancient Egypt became a complete mystery. Everything you know now was reconstructed from fragments, and we'll never know what we lost. In 391 CE, Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered all pagan temples closed throughout the empire. In Egypt, this decree ended institutions that had preserved knowledge for 3,000 years. Temple libraries burned. Priestly training stopped. The entire infrastructure of knowledge transmission collapsed within a generation. Hieroglyphic writing died. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at Philae Temple. After that, silence. No one could read the script that had recorded Egyptian thought, religion, science, and history for millennia. Astronomical observations accumulated over centuries were abandoned. Medical knowledge refined through generations of practice was lost. Mathematical techniques vanished. Historical records became unintelligible. Some knowledge survived through translation. Egyptian medical texts had been translated into Greek centuries earlier. These Greek versions were later translated into Arabic, influencing Islamic medicine. Egyptian astronomy contributed to Hellenistic science, which became part of the broader Mediterranean intellectual tradition. Egyptian mathematics influenced Greek geometry, but much knowledge existed only in temple contexts or hieroglyphic scripts. When temples closed and hieroglyphs became unreadable, that knowledge simply disappeared. No one preserved it, because no one valued it anymore. Evidence suggests some priests tried to save what they could. Texts were hidden in sealed chambers. Knowledge was passed orally to students who might preserve it, but these efforts largely failed. The institutional framework that had maintained Egyptian knowledge collapsed, and individual efforts couldn't compensate. Something unexpected survived underground. Egyptian religious practices went into hiding, transforming as they passed through generations who no longer understood their origins. Folk magic in Egypt preserved fragments of ancient rituals, words and gestures whose meanings were forgotten but whose forms persisted. Coptic Christianity incorporated Egyptian elements, festival dates coinciding with ancient celebrations. saints replacing local gods, ritual practices adapted from pharaonic religion. Hermetic traditions claiming Egyptian origins emerged, though these were largely Greek and Roman creations projecting mystical wisdom onto Egypt's mysterious past. Yet, recent scholarship suggests even these invented traditions preserved authentic fragments mixed with fantasy. The Coptic language, descended directly from ancient Egyptian, preserved vocabulary and grammatical structures. Though written in Greek alphabet rather than hieroglyphs, Coptic maintained linguistic continuity. This would prove crucial centuries later when scholars attempted to decode hieroglyphs. Ethiopian Christianity incorporated elements from Egyptian Christianity, which itself retained ancient traditions. The chain of transmission was broken and transformed, but traces remained. When Islamic armies conquered Egypt in 641 CE, they encountered a Christian, Greek-speaking population with no memory of pharaonic civilization. Islamic scholars valued ancient texts, translating Greek and Syriac works into Arabic, but they had no access to hieroglyphic sources. The pyramids and temples were incomprehensible ruins. Medieval Islamic Egypt treated ancient monuments as quarries for building materials and curiosities for travelers. No living memory connected these structures to their builders or purposes. Egypt's past was completely severed from its present. The loss was profound and permanent. Entire categories of knowledge vanished when the last literate Egyptians died. Religious philosophies developed over millennia. Scientific observations recorded across centuries. Literary traditions expressing uniquely Egyptian worldviews. Historical memories of 3,000 years of civilization. All gone. This wasn't natural death. It was cultural genocide. Roman and Christian authorities actively suppressed Egyptian religion. They destroyed texts. They punished practitioners. They systematically dismantled the knowledge infrastructure until nothing remained. The irony cuts deep. Christianity destroyed Egyptian religion but inadvertently preserved it. Coptic Christian texts, written in Egyptian language using Greek alphabet, became essential tools for 19th century scholars attempting to decode hieroglyphs. Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in 1822 relied partly on Coptic linguistic knowledge. From roughly 400 CE to 1822, ancient Egyptian civilization was completely unintelligible. 14 centuries of silence, hieroglyphs were mysterious symbols whose meanings were lost, pyramids' purposes were unknown. Egypt became a projection screen for European fantasies rather than a comprehensible historical civilization. We can never fully recover what was lost. Even with modern archaeology, translation efforts, and technological analysis, we access only fragments. The Egypt we think we know is reconstruction from pieces scattered across museums and archaeological sites worldwide. And we can never know what's missing. But while ancient knowledge was being lost, ancient artifacts were being stolen, and the story of who stole them, why, and what happened to Egypt's treasures reveals the final chapter of erasure, the physical plundering of an entire civilization. While you read this, someone in Egypt is illegally digging up artifacts to sell on the black market. The plunder that began with European colonizers never stopped, it just became more sophisticated. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European travelers treated Egypt as an open treasure house. Statues were removed from temples. Mummies were extracted from tombs and shipped to Europe for unwrapping parties that served as macabre entertainment. Papyri were purchased from dealers who acquired them through methods no one questioned too carefully. Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian strongman turned adventurer, used battering rams to break into sealed tombs. His goal wasn't preservation or study. It was acquisition. Objects for European patrons who wanted Egyptian curiosities decorating their homes. During Napoleonic Wars, French and British forces competed to seize artifacts as spoils of conquest. The Rosetta Stone, crucial to eventually decoding hieroglyphs, was seized by British forces from French possession. Neither nation considered that it belonged to Egypt. Early museum collectors bought everything Egyptian sellers offered, including modern forgeries they couldn't distinguish from authentic antiquities. The demand was insatiable. Supply emerged to meet it. The scale is staggering. The British Museum holds over 100,000 Egyptian objects. The Louvre, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, institutions across Europe and America possess hundreds of thousands more. Most were acquired through colonial-era excavations or purchases from dealers who obtained them through tomb robbing. Justifications were ready. Egypt couldn't preserve its own heritage, colonizers claimed. Universal museums made artifacts accessible to global audiences. Western science could better study Egyptian civilization than Egyptians themselves. These justifications crumble under examination. Many artifacts were destroyed through careless handling by early collectors more interested in spectacle than preservation. Museum storage often damaged objects through improper climate control or neglect. And removing artifacts from Egypt deprived Egyptians of their own heritage, severing connections between modern Egyptians and their ancestors. The plunder never stopped. It evolved. Tomb robbing remains economically lucrative. Rural areas with unguarded archaeological sites face ongoing illegal excavation. The global antiquities trade is worth billions, much of it illegal. Objects appear on markets with falsified provenance documentation. Wealthy collectors ask few questions about origins. The 2011 revolution brought chaos and opportunity. Museums were looted during civil unrest. Artifacts disappeared into private collections. Some have been recovered, many haven't. Dark web markets facilitate anonymous sales of stolen antiquities. Smuggling networks move objects from Egypt to international buyers. Despite laws protecting cultural heritage, enforcement is difficult and corruption enables trafficking. Repatriation debates intensify. Arguments for returning artifacts include simple justice, stolen property should be returned. Cultural heritage rights assert that Egyptians should control their own history. Practical concerns note that artifacts removed from archaeological contexts lose crucial information about their original settings. Arguments against repatriation cite preservation concerns. Some Egyptian facilities lack climate control and security that Western museums provide. Accessibility claims suggest Western museums reach larger global audiences. Legal complexity after centuries makes determining rightful ownership difficult. But the deeper issue transcends individual artifacts. The entire framework of Egyptology was colonial. European and American scholars claimed authority over Egyptian history. They excavated primarily to fill Western museums. They created interpretations serving Western interests, emphasizing exotic mystery over human reality. Decolonization efforts push back. Modern Egyptian archaeologists reclaim authority over their heritage. New museums in Egypt display world-class collections with Egyptian curatorial perspectives. International pressure grows for repatriation. UNESCO conventions protect cultural heritage. Recent successful repatriation cases set precedents. But every artifact in Western museums represents ongoing erasure. One less object contextualizing Egypt for Egyptians. One less piece of evidence available to Egyptian scholars. One less connection between modern Egyptians and their ancestors. The physical plundering continues what selective archaeology began, taking not just gold and statues, but the material evidence needed to reconstruct ordinary people's lives. The workers, farmers, children, women who built Egyptian civilization remain erased because their artifacts sit in storage thousands of miles from where they lived and died. All of this, the selective archaeology, the plundered artifacts, the erased histories led to one result: the Egypt you were taught in school, but now you know what they erased. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? And what does ancient Egypt's erasure tell us about power, memory, and who gets to tell history? Everything you think you know about ancient Egypt was designed by Victorian Englishmen to sell museum tickets and justify empire. The real Egypt? That was erased on purpose. Most people carry the same images when they think of Egypt. Pyramids built by enslaved masses under whips, mysterious hieroglyphs containing hidden wisdom, exotic mummies preserved through arcane rituals, pharaohs wielding absolute power. golden treasures beyond imagination. For some, even ancient aliens building monuments humans supposedly couldn't. Each image is construction, not discovery. Each serves purposes that have nothing to do with historical accuracy. The mummy obsession began with European medical delusion. Powdered mummy was believed to cure ailments. Thousands of mummies were ground up and consumed. When that fashion passed, Victorian-era society hosted mummy unwrapping parties, entertainment disguised as science. Bodies that families had prepared with care for eternal rest were destroyed for amusement. Modern media continues the tradition, portraying mummies as monsters in horror films, reinforcing the idea that Egyptian death practices were morbid rather than hopeful. Pyramids dominate Egyptian imagery because they're visually spectacular. They seem impossibly ambitious, feeding theories about lost technology or extraterrestrial assistance. They symbolize human achievement in ways that serve various ideologies, proof of what centralized authority can accomplish, monuments to human ambition, mysteries that justify expert interpretation. But focusing on pyramids obscures reality. Pyramid building occupied roughly 500 years of a 3,000-year civilization. 90% of Egyptian history occurred after pyramids. But that's not what gets taught or remembered. The gold obsession began practically. Gold was valuable loot during colonial plundering. Museums emphasized golden artifacts because they attracted visitors and justified acquisition budgets. The obsession persists because it makes Egypt seem magical, otherworldly, fundamentally different from ordinary human experience. Here's what shifts everything. The Egypt of popular imagination is almost entirely European invention. Mysterious, static, obsessed with death and gods, exotic and incomprehensible. But Egyptians themselves emphasize life, continuity, practical administration, human relationships. These weren't exotic enough for Western audiences who wanted spectacle and mystery. This invented Egypt served colonialism perfectly. Portraying ancient Egypt as mysterious and Oriental justified European claims to understand Egyptian heritage better than modern Egyptians. If the civilization was so alien, so fundamentally different, then obviously it required Western expertise to interpret. Colonial powers could position themselves as rescuers of Egyptian heritage from Egyptians themselves. It serves capitalism equally well. Exotic Egypt sells. Movies, museum exhibitions, tourism packages, countless commercial products leverage Egyptian imagery. The more mysterious and spectacular, the more marketable. Truth doesn't sell like fantasy. It serves narratives about civilization and hierarchy. If ancient Egypt was all about powerful pharaohs and divine kings, then civilization requires strong authority and clear hierarchy. A convenient message for maintaining modern power structures. The possibility that civilization was built by ordinary people negotiating and resisting power threatens that narrative. Racism permeates popular Egypt myths in ways both obvious and subtle. The persistent claim that ancient Egyptians couldn't have built pyramids without lost technology or alien intervention reveals inability to credit African civilization with achievement. The theories are absurd but persistent because they preserve assumptions about who can accomplish great things. Afrocentrist counter-narratives claim Egypt as purely African, while dismissing Mediterranean influences, creating their own distortions. Egypt becomes a battleground for contemporary identity politics, rather than a comprehensible historical civilization. The real Egypt this documentary has presented is different, complex, stratified, human. Ordinary people worked, loved, suffered, resisted, created culture, and lived full lives. Not mysterious, not exotic. Human in ways that transcend time and culture. Recovering this Egypt matters because it shows civilization was built by ordinary people's labor. Power was contested and negotiated, not simply imposed. Resistance is universal wherever exploitation exists. Historical erasure serves power by hiding these truths. Every society creates usable pasts, versions of history serving contemporary needs. The Egypt we inherited is Europe's usable past, constructed to serve European purposes. But we can create different narratives from the same evidence. Narratives centering ordinary people. Narratives challenging power rather than glorifying it. But here's the thing. While we've been taught a false version of Egypt, real Egyptians, descendants of those ancient workers and farmers, are still there. And they've been trying to tell their own story. The question is, are we listening? Modern Egyptians are descended from the workers who built the pyramids. They still live in the same villages, work the same land, and maintain the same monuments. But Western experts still treat them like they're foreigners to their own heritage. Genetic studies reveal remarkable continuity. Modern Egyptians carry substantial ancient Egyptian ancestry. There's been admixture, Arab, Ottoman, and other populations contributed to the gene pool over millennia. But the core population shows direct descent from ancient Egyptians. This contradicts popular assumptions that modern Egyptians are entirely different people occupying the same geography. The implications are profound. Modern Egyptians have legitimate ancestral claims to ancient heritage. Yet they also face complex relationships with that heritage due to dramatic cultural transformation. Islam changed Egypt fundamentally. Arabic replaced Coptic, the language descended directly from ancient Egyptian. Islam replaced Christianity, which had replaced pharaonic religion. Cultural orientation shifted toward the Arab and Islamic world rather than Mediterranean or African identities. Yet continuities persist. Agricultural practices along the Nile remain similar to ancient methods. Farmers still plant according to flood cycles, though modern dams have altered the rhythm. Some folk beliefs preserve ancient elements, transformed beyond recognition but maintaining traces. Geographic settlement patterns show remarkable stability. Villages occupy the same locations they've occupied for thousands of years. Modern Egyptian attitudes toward the ancient past are complex. Pride in achievements, pyramids serve as national symbols, sources of identity and prestige. Frustration with Western control of narratives and artifacts. Why are Egyptian treasures displayed in London and Paris rather than Cairo? Sometimes ambivalence. Ancient Egypt was pagan, requiring negotiation for a Muslim-majority nation claiming that heritage. The Egyptian archaeological community increasingly reclaims authority. Egyptian archaeologists conduct excavations, manage museums, challenge Western interpretations. Zahi Hawass, controversial but prominent, demands repatriation and asserts Egyptian expertise. New museums display collections with Egyptian curatorial perspectives rather than Western frameworks. Egyptian scholars publish research centering Egyptian academic traditions. Tensions emerge from competing pressures. Economic dependence on tourism creates incentive to maintain exotic narratives attracting visitors. Cultural pride demands dignified portrayal of ancestors as humans, not mysteries. The balance is delicate and constantly negotiated. Egyptian workers and guards at archaeological sites carry knowledge passed through families. Descendants of ancient workers, often from the same villages, maintain monuments their ancestors built. They possess deep understanding of sites which stones are unstable, where water damage threatens, what seasonal changes affect preservation. Yet foreign archaeologists often ignore them, dismissing their knowledge as unscientific folklore. The colonial dynamic persists. Western experts arrive, conduct research using local labor, publish findings in Western journals, and leave. Egyptian workers who made the research possible remain uncredited. Some claim oral traditions in villages near ancient sites preserve stories correlating with archaeological findings. Knowledge transmitted across millennia through family lines. This remains controversial and debated. Skeptics note that oral tradition transforms dramatically across generations, and that correlations might be coincidental. But the possibility suggests that dismissing local knowledge has costs. Modern Egyptians use the ancient past strategically, as national pride invoking pharaonic glory to assert Egyptian importance globally, as economic resource tourism provides crucial revenue. As political symbol, both revolutionary and authoritarian governments invoke ancient Egypt to legitimize authority. As cultural heritage demanding preservation and proper interpretation, The complexity resists simple narratives. Modern Egyptians aren't simply ancient Egyptians reborn. Language, religion, culture have transformed dramatically over 2 millennia. But neither are they foreigners to this heritage. Their descendants navigating complex inheritance, claiming what's theirs while acknowledging transformation. Egyptian educators teach ancient history in schools, though sometimes with nationalist emphasis that oversimplifies. Egyptian artists reinterpret ancient themes in contemporary work, creating dialogue between past and present. Egyptian activists demand repatriation and control of heritage, challenging Western museums' continued possession of Egyptian artifacts. Egypt's story isn't finished. Modern Egyptians write new chapters while negotiating relationships with ancient past. Their voices deserve central place in discussions about Egyptian heritage, not as subjects studied by foreign experts, but as inheritors and interpreters of their own history. So what do we do now? We can't undo the erasure. The lost knowledge is lost forever. The stolen artifacts are scattered globally. The distorted narratives have shaped generations. But we can change how we tell the story going forward. And that matters more than you might think. They erased Egypt's ordinary people because acknowledging them threatened power. We're recovering their stories because remembering them threatens the same power structures that operate today. Choose what you do with that knowledge. We can't fully recover ancient Egypt. Too much is lost forever. Knowledge destroyed when temples closed. Artifacts scattered across global museums. Entire categories of human experience erased because they weren't considered worth documenting. No amount of archaeology or translation can restore what's gone. We can't undo historical erasure. Victorian Egyptologists who focused on kings rather than workers are dead. Colonial administrators who plundered artifacts are dead. The damage is permanent. We can't eliminate bias from our interpretations. Every historian brings perspectives shaped by their own time and culture. Perfect objectivity is impossible, but we can make conscious choices about whose perspectives we center, what evidence we value, what narratives we amplify. This documentary made choices to center workers rather than pharaohs, to emphasize resistance rather than compliance, to demystify rather than exoticize, to show ordinary people as full humans with agency, not as passive masses or exotic others. These aren't neutral scholarly choices. They're political choices about whose history matters. Every history is selective. We can't include everything. Every interpretation reflects values. Every narrative serves purposes. The question isn't whether to be political. All history is political. The question is whether to be conscious and honest about it. Traditional Egyptology made political choices too, focusing on kings and gold served colonial interests. Emphasizing mystery and exoticism justified Western control of Egyptian heritage. Ignoring workers' resistance preserved narratives about ancient obedience to authority. Those choices shaped what you were taught, what you believed, what seemed natural and inevitable about how societies function. Now you know differently. You know that pyramid workers weren't enslaved, that they could read and write, that they organized and struck and won. You know that farmers resisted taxation, that children worked but also played, that women owned businesses and sued in court. You know that intermediate periods might have meant more freedom for ordinary people than unified kingdoms. You know that workers carved insults into monuments and cursed their supervisors. What do you do with that knowledge? You can share it. Challenge misconceptions when you encounter them. Tell people that the Egypt they learnt in school was constructed to serve purposes that had nothing to do with truth. You can demand it. From museums that still display stolen artifacts without acknowledging theft. From schools teaching exotic mysteries rather than human realities. From media perpetuating stereotypes. From institutions controlling Egyptian heritage without Egyptian voices. You can use it to think critically about power and erasure in all contexts, not just ancient Egypt, because the same mechanisms operate today, whose voices get heard, whose labor is valued and acknowledged, who gets written out of current histories, essential workers during pandemics whose contributions are forgotten the moment crisis passes, farmers whose labor sustains civilization but who remain politically powerless, children whose experiences and perspectives are dismissed as unimportant. Countless people doing essential work that makes modern life possible, while credit goes to those who manage or profit from that work. The dynamics ancient Egypt exemplified continue. People build, create, labor. Elites extract, control, narrate. Resistance emerges wherever power operates. And those who control narratives choose what to remember and what to forget. This documentary chose to remember what others erased. The Egypt of ordinary people, their labor and love, their resistance and resilience, their full humanity. That Egypt was always the real one. We just had to choose to see it. History isn't fixed. Each generation reinterprets the past based on present concerns and values. We can choose to tell histories that honor forgotten people, that challenge power rather than glorify it, that reveal alternatives to injustice rather than presenting hierarchy as inevitable. We can choose truth over convenience, complexity over simplicity, justice over tradition. The Egypt they erased can be recovered, partially, imperfectly, but meaningfully. And that recovery matters because it changes not just our past, but our present and our future. It changes what seems possible, what seems inevitable, what seems worth fighting for. Ancient Egypt fell 3,000 years ago, but the choice between erasing ordinary people and honoring them continues. Every day, in every history we tell, in every narrative we accept or challenge, choose wisely.